Good morning. Good morning. Oh. You don't like it on my neck? Now what do I do with it? That's the thing. Well, good morning. I'm looking forward to another wonderful session this morning. And it's great to see so many of you back here. And I imagine there will be some more. And there's even one newcomer. I want to take this opportunity to give thanks to the people who made this amazing conference possible. Lizzie Feidelson, the Center's administrative manager, has worked wonders to make this center happen. And when the rug was pulled out from us, we found another rug. And it's just been like that, one amazing setback after another. But we always persevered, and Lizzie was right there driving things forward. Never have I seen such a mix of capability and energy as she has shown over the past year. Thank you very much, Lizzie. I also want to say that my assistant, Catherine Pikula, is another amazing character. She has helped me with everything I do at the center, bar none. She knows every move I make, everything I ever wrote, everything I ever said. She's my memory, my editor. It's just, she's made the difference between enjoying my role, my career, and not enjoying it. And so I'm very grateful to Catherine Pikula for sticking with me through thick and thin. Without further ado, I give the floor to Peter for his presentation.
Okay, well, thank you, Ned, and it was a great honor to be asked to take part in this anniversary. I have very happy memories of the first of your conferences, your Festschrift, which took place in an even more trying time than now, and I know that it was such a happy occasion for so many of us, and really sort of filled us with hope that things would carry on. And you've carried on amazingly for the past 20 years. Congratulations for everything that's happened. So my talk today was put together along with my co-author of 34 years, Philippe Aghion, and here he is, couldn't be with us in person. And it's based on the work that we've done for the past 34 years, really, on what we call Schumpeterian economic growth. And so I'll also be channeling this man, but only to a small extent. Our theory is, of course, based on the idea of creative destruction, the idea that a dynamic economy, in order to sustain growth, has to be continually renewed with new innovations that render obsolete old innovations, and which in turn are destined to be rendered obsolete themselves. It turns out that this process, the theory that we've worked out, is very conventional, mainstream, neoclassical in its construction, but it has some fairly radical implications, I think. And I think it has, in particular, some implications that help to explain this particular phenomenon, the recent burst of productivity growth in the U.S., but the even more recent stagnation that's taken place. There are a lot of explanations out there. After Ian Golden's presentation yesterday, I'm ashamed to only present 3 of them here. He talked about 22 of them. But these are 3 explanations that have appeared in the mainstream conventional economics literature. There's the first one, of course, for which Robert Gordon is famous, the argument that really all of the great innovations have already been made, and we've just got to get used to the fact that we're not going to be making technological progress as we did in the past. There may be something to that, although I think it's questionable, and I tend to side with Joel Mokyr in his skepticism about this argument. There are also a number of measurement issues which turn out to be, as Ian was saying yesterday, fairly limited in scope, important though they may be in certain sectors, and they don't exhibit the kind of timing that's needed to explain the recent ups and downs of productivity growth. I doubt if there's one single explanation for what's going on, but certainly there's room for a lot more. And it turns out that our theory does have some very definite implications that I think shed some light. And they have to do with one of the general approaches, which I was happy to see Ian Golden included on his final short list of 3 or 4 that made the cut. And it emphasizes the role of what David Otter and others call superstar firms, highly productive firms, use relatively little labor, are very profitable, and have come to dominate in a lot of industries. And our theory implies that under many circumstances, if you get a proliferation of highly productive firms dominating a large number of industries in the economy, that will tend to suppress the process of creative destruction. So to see how that works, it helps to go back to the theory and talk about how it works. The most important thing is that once you put creative destruction in the heart of a growth model, you have to realize something that's been obvious to economic historians for a long time, but which hadn't really made its way into aggregate growth theory before, which is that technical progress and economic growth creates losers as well as winners. It creates losses for the people whose fortunes depend upon the technologies that are rendered obsolete. And more generally, in the kinds of theories that we have been developing, there are heterogeneous people in different industries with different interests. There are leaders and followers, there are incumbents, there are potential entrants, and so on. Some of whom have a great interest in making technical progress, and others who have an interest in blocking technical progress. And in particular, the theory has a very Marxian kind of implication, which is that the process of creative destruction really does contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction. There are a couple of mechanisms whereby if you do get a lot of highly successful firms dominating a number of industries, that tends to reduce or perhaps even in some circumstances eliminate the prospect for technological progress in those sectors. And there are 2 classes of mechanisms whereby this happens. One of them is what I would call the automatic mechanism. When we take into account that technical progress generally has to take place step by step, so that when one firm is a long way behind the leader in that industry, it's not just one leapfrogging innovation that's going to make a leader out of the follower, but it may take us a succession of innovations in order to catch up. Then you realize that how innovative a particular industry is going to be depends very much on the competitive situation in that industry. And in particular, the most innovative industries tend to be ones where the motive of escaping competition is strongest. That's the case where you've got firms that are competing intensively and fairly neck and neck technologically, and it's like Ethel Merman used to say, you got to have a gimmick. They've got to break away from this technology by having an innovation in order to generate profits. And that turns out in our theory, when we quantify things, to be the strongest motive for innovation. And on the contrary, you get the least innovation in a sector that is where there's not a lot of intense competition. The market is shared by a small number of firms that have a great lead over their followers. And in that situation, the leaders aren't really threatened by very much by the followers, and the followers have such dim prospects of catching up because they're so far behind that they tend to find the expenditures on R&D not worthwhile. And that's where you tend to find that innovation is the weakest. And it turns out that under some circumstances, you can even get complete stagnation, that nobody innovates in the industry. So there's a lot of evidence that these so-called superstar firms are really dominating in many industries. And I know many of you will be familiar with this sort of evidence. Ottor and his co-authors have a recent paper in the Quarterly Journal of Economics that it spells out this evidence very clearly in U.S. industries. You've got the phenomenon of increasing concentration, which has been taking place for quite some time. Firms have increased markups. There's a decreased share of labor income in value added in many sectors. There's an increased share of profits in value added. And these things are highly correlated across sectors. It's not as if you have some sectors that are getting increasingly concentrated and others where there's an increased profit share. These tend to be the same industries where they're more predominant. And it's largely a composition effect that's taking place. It's not as if all firms have higher markups than they used to across the board, as if the whole distribution of markups has shifted up. But what seems to have happened is that firms with higher markups are taking a bigger share of the market. They're taking a bigger share of employment. They're taking an even bigger share of sales, because they also tend to be the firms that have that generate the least share of labor income in their value added. And these are big effects. So, for example, Jan de Lucker and co-authors in a recent Quarterly Journal paper have shown that since the 1980s, the average markup in U.S. Firms has gone from about 21% over marginal cost to somewhere like 61% over marginal cost. The Gustavo Grullon has argued that across three-digit U.S. industries, the Herfindahl index, Herfindahl index, which is the standard measure that the Justice Department uses in antitrust actions, is up in the past 20 years in 75% of those three-digit industries, and by an average of over 65%. So these are really big numbers. The same is true for all of these other effects. A recent paper by Aksigit and Ates has argued that there's also evidence of widespread widespread slowdown in business dynamism that we think is really related to this. So for example, and these are things that are all things that you would expect if you had a large number of industries that had come to be dominated by large firms that were successful in suppressing the creative destruction process, successful in discouraging or preventing entry and innovation by follower firms. So for example, the technology gap between leaders and laggards in various industries appears to be growing. This is a paper by Dan Andrews a few years ago, an OECD working paper, that shows that the average labor productivity of the global top 5% of firms, measured by sales, many of which are American firms, rose by about 30% in the 12 years following 2001, whereas the other 95% of firms' productivity this is labor productivity, tended to grow by less than 10%. So, you know, it's the same sort of inequality, upper end inequality that we see in income and wealth distribution, but in here it's taking place in the labor productivity distribution. There are also, all of the other things that I've listed here are things that John Halterwanger, who's been studying creative destruction for even longer than Philippe and I have, but mainly in product and labor markets, has argued reflecting decreased dynamism. There are reduced firm entry rates. Since the 1980s, firm entry rates, measured as the annual percentage of firms that are newly entered that year, has gone down from about 14% down to 8% in the last year that they measured, which was 2012. The employment share, likewise, of new firms has gone down from about 16% to 8%. And the job reallocation rate, which is the total annual job destruction plus job creation rate, has gone down from about 34% to 25%. And the dispersion of firm growth rates has gone down, which they attribute to relatively low activity among young firms. Young firms tend to be the firms that grow the most rapidly. And the dispersion that you see in the data normally is attributable to the fact that there are young firms growing rapidly and a lot of old firms that aren't growing as fast. That's not happening as much, and that's reducing the dispersion in the data. As I say, all of these are the sorts of things that you would expect to see from this superstar phenomenon. Why do we have these superstars? Well, you know, there are a lot of possible explanations. There are, you know, a lot of people think that we've got lots of markets where there are winner-take-all technologies that just make it natural that we're going to end up with monopolies or tight oligopolies. A lot of people think that it has to do with relaxed antitrust enforcement over the years. But there are at least 3 different papers out there in the literature now that are based on the work that Philippe and I have done that actually derive these sorts of results as an implication from particular parameter changes. And I want to just talk about them a little bit. The first one, with the increased difficulty of catch-up, comes from the paper that I mentioned by Exeget and Atez, where they take a parameter in the step-by-step catch-up model that Philippe and I have, a parameter whereby a firm that is behind the leader finds it easier to move one technology step ahead than if that firm was the leader itself. And the idea is simply the idea of technology transfer, the thing that makes catching up to a leader easier than being the leader yourself. He argued that if you just take that sort of the sort of model that we worked out and postulate a reduction in that, what we call the help factor that allows followers to catch up, you end up with the sorts of predictions that we talked about, and they managed to sort of imply almost all of these facts that I talked about. And now, what does that reduction in the help factor represent? Well, it could be many things, some of which might be the automatic mechanism that I talked about, some of which might reflect the strategic mechanism. There are it could represent patent thickets that firms have managed to create through strategic R&D or through acquisitions. And Aksijit and Atte has mentioned that the distribution of patent ownership has really drastically changed, and that the share of patent reassignments that are now owned by the top 1% of patent owners in the US has really spiked in the last 20 years or so. It could be that that firms are able to make use of proprietary data sets, and that's just much more important in many industries than it used to be, which makes it harder to catch up. It could be a result of offshoring, because technology transfer is aided by geographical proximity, and if it's taking place somewhere around the world, it's maybe harder to catch up. It could be just path-dependent technologies and tacit knowledge that are more important now than they used to be. Or it could be regulations that are favoring insiders. And of course, one of the strategic mechanisms that whereby firms that are leaders want to avoid competition is in lobbying and political activity. We all know about the rise in dark money. It's pretty hard to measure exactly how much of that comes from corporate incumbent firms and exactly what's going on with it. But we do have various measures of lobbying. There's a very interesting recent paper by Bertrand Bombardini and Trebi arguing that there's been a spike in lobby since 1998 in their data, and that a lot of that has been a spike in what they call connected lobbying rather than expert lobbying. That is to say, when you buy these lobbyists, what's becoming more important now, much more important, is not what the lobbyists know, but who they know. And so all of these are possible interpretations of that result of Aksijit and Agit. There's another paper that Philippe has written with Bergeau, Beaupart, Clinault, and Lee that's still an MBER working paper, but I'm sure it will be published soon, that emphasizes the decreased cost of managing a large number of enterprises. They argue that modern technology has made this possible, and they point out that a lot of the phenomena that Autor point out, the decreased labor share, the increased profitability, and so on, is highly correlated with technology, the technology intensity of a firm, and they argue that produces the same sort of result. Mien, Liu, and Sufi actually argue that it could just be a result of low interest rates. It turns out that our model has the implication that we didn't realize, that as the rate of interest goes to zero, the steady state equilibrium growth rate also goes to zero in that model. And because what happens is that the value of becoming a leader becomes so great that you get firms that end up establishing leads that in the end almost entirely snuff out innovation by followers, making it so hopeless. All of these are possible, but all of them tend to have the same kind of effect. And we have a little bit to say about policy. We're not really policy experts. That's not our area. There seem to be some obvious things that you could do, more vigorous antitrust, especially focusing on preemptive mergers, which seem to be a big strategy for incumbents to protect their lead, breaking up superstar firms, maybe changing patent laws to disallow a lot of the anti-competitive patenting that's taking place. But these things are all difficult. We think, and I'll just take one more minute to suggest that one of the most obvious remedies would be to try something that the United States has tried in the past that has worked spectacularly successfully, which is industrial policy. The Department of Agriculture, for example, had a spectacularly successful policy of experimental stations, which over the period from the 1930s up until and through the 1980s led to sustained productivity growth, the introduction of scientific farming into the United States, and a lot of it was focused on producing the hybrid seeds, the research on which Zvi Griliches once estimated many years ago to have a social rate of return of over 700% per year. It was an amazingly successful story. Another successful story has been the efforts of the US Department of Defense to promote computer technology. Research that was sponsored by or created by the Department of Defense produced the first computer, the first operating system, the first programming language. It established the protocols for the internet. So this is something that's been done. Where would you target next? Well, it seems obvious to us that you should be targeting some sector that's been stagnant for a long time, that's dominated by a lot of politically connected insiders, and where innovation would clearly be very productive. And why not the energy sector? It's not that we think that we can solve the climate problem with doing this, it just seems obvious. If I interpret him correctly, this is the same argument that Luigi Paganetta was making yesterday. You want to revive innovation, where best to do it? But here. I know that there are a lot of arguments that will be made that governments can't pick winners. But in this case, it seems that if you're going to be promoting innovation and you don't promote some disruptive innovation in the energy sectors, you're just going to be picking losers. And I'll stop there.
And I know we can all hear each other, but this is good for the video.
Yeah, am I allowed to ask two questions? Because the last point raised one that I'd like to ask about, and then I'd like to ask a more general question here about superstar firms. So the first question is, isn't the energy sector, between fracking and the huge reduction in natural gas costs, a particularly innovative sector already?
The social rate of return of those innovations, I don't think, has been all that great. The fracking has resulted in a lot of methane escaping into the atmosphere, for example. It's been producing earthquakes all over the place. I mean, there are a lot of negative costs about this. That's not a long-term solution. And yet, the thing you have to remember is that when it comes to energy innovations, there's a lot of path dependence. There's a lot of lock-in. Once the more you promote innovation of one particular energy source, the easier it is for further innovations to take place in that direction. And there's quite a bit of evidence producing this. Natural gas is not a long-run solution to the climate problem, I don't think. And I would argue that if there's ever been an example of success in governments promoting targeted innovation, it has been the success of the U.S. and various European governments in promoting the production of electricity through renewable sources. It is now almost everywhere in the world much privately less expensive to produce electricity using solar and wind power than it is by burning fossil fuels. There's still a lot of innovations to be done in the storage and distribution and use of this energy and so forth, but there's been a tremendous success there.
Okay, so the second question is that when you look at these superstar firms, as opposed to sort of the old generation of firms, one of the things that seems to be there in technology is that they're much more highly specialized than in the past. So if you look at IT, Google does only search. Amazon basically makes all its money on cloud computing, which is a part of the business. Oracle does database systems. Microsoft does core systems. In the old days, IBM did everything. Is that a factor here or not?
Well, I don't know. I mean, that may be true of Google. It's not true of Alphabet, and I don't know of I don't know of what sort of spillovers and synergies there are across those sectors. I mean, the argument that Philippe has been pushing is that it's become cheaper to branch out and innovate into different sectors, which is what a lot, you know, and now Meta, I guess, is supposed to be the next example of that. Yeah, so I'm not sure where the question was going. But,
Well, if there is something else going on, which is leading to specialization rather than, and Alphabet makes no money outside of Google.
really?
Nothing. I mean, you can see the financials. So, and you know, Microsoft, when it goes into Xbox, makes no money.
Yeah.
But if that's what's going on, it suggests that there are other things taking place here.
I'm sure there are other things taking place. I would not argue that this is a silver bullet to explain everything. Yeah. Ned? Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks for this lucid Oh, God. Thanks for this lucid exposition of the Aghion-Howitt thesis, which has had huge influence, and justifiably so. It has Schumpeterian roots. I think it's fair to say. If it's not fair to say, please correct me. I think the basic thought is that new commercial ideas are made possible by scientific advances and maybe a broader category of advances. And I just want to say that there is another perspective on this subject, and there's room for two perspectives, I think. In another perspective, my book, Mass Flourishing, tells the story of the role of values in quickening the pace of innovation in America and later in France and Germany, but especially America. And you might say this is an outlandish idea. Values, this is not economics, but I think it has a huge role to play in human behavior. So 7 years later, my research team and I came out with another book, Dynamism, which puts to test the idea about the importance of values, and it came out surprisingly well, or came out very well. I wish we had data on more values that are left out by the people who do values, but using all the data that we could use, we did find that values correlate enormously. Differences in values across countries correlate enormously well with differences in the rate of indigenous innovation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I might just say one thing about that relates to our last point about green energy. There are a number of people have argued, and I think it's correct, that one way you can really promote decarbonizing innovations is through public opinion. There's you know, even in the United States, green energy is extremely popular in opinion polls, and there's a lot of evidence that firms really want to be considered on the good side of this. Even the American Petroleum Institute has an Energy for Progress public relations campaign that presents them as the defenders of the environment. You know, you have to somehow keep these people honest from time to time. But there is I think evidence that consumer values do direct corporate innovation in many cases.
So I know there's so many questions, but I feel we should move on, not to get too far behind. Maybe we can circle back at the end and just have some more time. But let's go to Michelle now.
Well, it's really great to be here. I want to thank Ned for inviting a psychologist to this awesome conference. I'm at Stanford, but I'm a native New Yorker by training. So as you know, that sticks with you for your whole life, and so I'm making a lot of trouble out there. And I'm going to pick up on Ned's comment about values and talk about social norms today and some of the work that we've been doing this around the world. And I'll start with a story about two fish, and they're swimming along one morning, and they pass by another fish who says, "Hey boys, how's the water?" And they swim on, and one looks at the other, if they could talk, and says, "What the heck is water?" And this is a simple story, but makes a profound point, which is that sometimes the most important realities around us are the things that we don't see, that we take for granted. And for fish, that's water, and for humans, that's culture. And culture is this incredibly interesting puzzle. I've been studying it for 30 years. I dye my hair, so you can't tell. And, it's omnipresent. It's around us 24/7, but we really don't recognize it until we actually leave our cultural bubble, and then we finally realize that, in fact, we've been socialized to ascribe to a certain set of norms and values and so forth. It's profoundly interesting for me as a cross-cultural psychologist to try to make those underlying cultural codes more visible for scientists, but for lay people alike. I think that Ned encountered my work on Fareed when he was talking about some of this work in April. And I'm going to get to some COVID data later on. But what's so interesting is that as humans, we've made really great technological accomplishments. We put a man on the moon, we've wired the world and the earth, we've discovered the laws of physics. But maybe we can start thinking about discovering the laws of culture. From a theoretical point of view, that's super interesting, but also maybe it can help us make this a better world. So my team, the Culture Lab, is very interdisciplinary. We do a lot of field research, lab experiments. We partner with evolutionary game theorists, and we do some neuroscience. And I'm going to kind of give you a sense of what that research program looks like. And we use a lot of these methods because every method is flawed, as we know. So we try to triangulate with different methods. So let me start with sort of how I got interested in this. I went to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana to work with Harry Triandis. He was one of the founders of the field. And I was doing some work on individualism with him, sort of this distinction of how much you focus on an independent self versus your close in-groups, like your family. And then I started thinking about other distinctions of culture. So what cross-cultural psychologists try to do is place nations on metrics in terms of their psychological characteristics. And we try to understand why those differences evolve from a cultural evolution point of view, what function they might serve, and what consequences they have, multi-level consequences for human groups. So I'm going to take you on a little journey of what I've been working on over the last 10, 15 years. And it started with some observations going around the world that you see a lot of differences in terms of the number of rules and constraints that you have across the world. For many of you that have been to Singapore, you know what's called the fine country. You can get fined for various things, like spitting or not flushing the toilet in public settings, or bringing in large quantities of gum into the country. Even if you walk naked in front of your curtains at night, that can land you a fine. I'm just warning you, just in case you're all thinking about that. If you take a quick plane ride over to New Zealand, you see very different types of behavior. You see people walking barefoot in banks. You might see them lighting couches on fire on campuses. Other contrasts you've probably seen around the world, for example, in Germany, you might see people waiting patiently on street corners even if there's no cars around. In the US, in New York, my beloved New York City, you see people constantly jaywalking, even with kids in tow. This on the left is a really interesting new device they're piloting in some German cities to try to incentivize people to stay put. It's actually a game of street pong. It's an electric game. This dude here is playing street pong with a person across the street, and it's actually, I've actually talked to the owners of this technology. They actually show you when the light's about to change, and it's kind of a nice incentive to stay put. On a more serious note, you might see other contrasts, like, for example, in some countries it's illegal to smoke weed. You can get the death penalty for this. In other contexts, in the Netherlands, you can openly smoke weed. And of course, in the United States, you see differences in this also. And all of these examples reflect something more fundamental about how strictly groups abide by social norms. Social norms are unwritten rules of behavior that sometimes get more instantiated in codes, like in Singapore. They're incredibly important human device. I think they're one of the most interesting, important things we've developed as humans because they help us predict each other's behavior and they help us to coordinate. They serve a function of coordination. And so you can try to imagine, just as a thought experiment, a world without social norms. So you go outside and people are driving on whatever side of the street they want to. You go into a restaurant, your favorite restaurant in New York City, and people are stealing each other's food and belching loudly. That sounds like my New York family dinner, actually. Or, imagine people having sex anywhere, like on streets and in, movie theaters, like on Seinfeld. Like, there's a reason why we don't do these things, and it's because we developed social norms to help each other behave and to predict each other's behavior. So they're really the glue that binds human groups together, and they've been with us for as long as eternity. But as I mentioned, some groups are more strict in how they abide by those social norms. We call them tight cultures. And other groups are looser. They have weaker norms, and they're more permissive. This distinction of tight-loose actually goes back to Herodotus. If you look at his book, The Histories, it's actually the first cross-cultural psych text where he contrasts groups like the Egyptians with very strict rules, and where there's a lot of punishments for deviation from those rules, with the Persians, who he argued had way more permissiveness. This distinction, the name tight-loose, comes from an anthropologist, Pietro Pelto, who wrote about it in the late 60s. He was studying this by accident, and he's an anthropologist. He was in the Scott Labs studying how snowmobiles affect behavior. But he found something much more interesting about the Scott Labs, was they were super loose. And he tried to explain this in a paper that he wrote, and I sort of picked up on where he left off. We wanted to understand, can we measure this construct at different levels of analysis? Does it have any kind of common homology across levels? As we'd see in a fractal pattern, coming metaphor from physics. And also, again, what might cause the evolution of these differences and what its consequence, what they may be. So I'm going to take you on a little bit of a kind of a quick trip on what we know about this construct. The first investigation into this was a national level study. We published the study in Science. It was, not a huge sample size, but it was trying to test proof of concept about the theory and some of its correlates and some predictors. We were gathering surveys around the world, asking people about the level of norm strength in their environment. For example, asking them about, how many rules there are, how strict are they? Also asking them about whether or not people get sanctioned and are punished for deviance from rules. We can see that people share their perceptions about that construct, and there's wide variation around the world, with places like Singapore, Japan, Germany, Austria tending to lean tight, and places like the US, Greece, the Netherlands, Brazil leaning looser. So this is a continuum, and all cultures have tight and loose elements, but we can see that they might veer in one way or another. Other measures that we also used in the study were actually asking people to rate how appropriate are 15 behaviors across 15 situations. So for example, how appropriate is it to argue in a bank or eat in a classroom? That's my pet peeve. Or kiss in a library. We have all kind of combinations of these variables. And this, what we can see here is we can measure situational strength. While all cultures have variation in how strict or permissive situations are. For example, this is a pretty tight situation. If I start dancing and breaking out some bourbon, you might tell Ned you need to be more selective in who you bring here. All cultures have tight and loose situations, but what we could see is that in tight cultures, the range of behavior that was seen as permissible was much more reduced across the board, across situations. What that means is that being in a public park, for example, in Pakistan, is very different than being in the United States, where there's a more restricted range of variation. In any event, I want to just give you a kind of a general gist of what this is correlated with. And I summarize this as an order versus openness trade-off. Tight cultures in our data have a lot of order. The measures I'm just mentioning correlate with things like having lower crime and having more monitoring. When I sent my RAs around the world measuring how many security cameras are there in streets, there's way more of those per capita in tight cultures. Tight cultures also have more order when it comes to uniformity. We see that they have people who are driving more similar cars, wearing more similar clothes. One interesting unobtrusive indication of this kind of synchrony is in clocks on city streets. So we actually measured how synchronized are clocks in city streets around the world and correlated that measure with our tightness measure. And it turns out that some cultures, they're off by milliseconds, like they're identical, like in Germany and Japan. In other cultures like Italy, Brazil, you're not totally sure what time it is. You know, the clocks are really off. Actually, another study that came out in the Journal of Financial Economics from a different team found that our measure was correlated with stock price synchronicity, sort of the R squared, how tightly coupling of buying and selling stocks. And also tight cultures where there are stricter punishments for deviance have people who are socialized to manage their impulses more. There's more self-control and social regulation in tighter cultures, and that manifests itself in them having lower debt, lower obesity, lower alcoholism. So actually, even in writing the book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, I was doing some research on this, and I found that even pets are skinnier in tight cultures. My obese dog, Portuguese water dog, is an N of 1 example of that. And that just suggests that tight cultures, they corner the market on order, but loose cultures struggle with order. They have less coordination, they have more crime, and they have more self-regulation problems in general. But loose cultures corner the market on openness. They tend to be much more tolerant of a variety of different people, immigrants, stigmatized individuals. They clearly also have problems with this, but relatively speaking, they're much more open. We've shown this with World Value Survey data. We also did a recent field experiment where I sent my RAs back to their home countries to ask for help in city streets or in stores. And I just did this simple intervention. I was, in one condition, having them wear fake facial warts on their face, which you can buy on the internet. In another condition, I had them dressing up with, like, tattoos and nose rings. And in the third condition, they were just wearing their normal face. And they were deployed to their home countries. And what we found was really interesting. And when people were just wearing their normal faces, there was no difference in helping behavior in tight and loose cultures. But when they were wearing those ridiculous stigmas, were far more likely to be helped in loose cultures. So we could see that both in field experiments and survey data. There's also more creativity, idea generation. Some large crowdsourcing studies of creativity find that people from loose cultures are more likely to enter these contests or more likely to win. And they're also more likely to be open to change. So in some computational models, when we insert new norms, like a cultural shock, into these models, we see that loose cultures, that norm takes takes off really very quickly. And I can talk about how we operationalize tight loose in these models in the Q&A. So what might predict tight loose? There's no effect to GDP. There's tight cultures that are rich and poor, and likewise with loose cultures. There's no common language or tradition or even geographical location. So what might predict it was really what we were interested in this particular study. This is correlational, so it's really just proof of concept. But my hunch was, and I was betting NSF's money on this, is that there's one important predictor, which is essentially the degree to which a country's experienced a lot of chronic threat, either from Mother Nature, think like chronic disasters and famine, or from human nature. Think how many times has your nation been potentially invaded by its neighbors? Long time ago, my 5-year-old said, "Are we worried about Mexico and Canada invading us?" Which I thought was a hilarious question. I mean, some people might think that now. But, the U.S. has been a culture where it has been really relatively unthreatened by its neighbors relative to other cultures. Other cultures like Japan have had chronic national threat in terms of disasters, famine, even things like population density. You think about Singapore has about 20,000 people per square mile. There could be a lot of potential chaos in that environment, and Lee Kuan Yew kind of got note of that. He's a good cross-cultural psychologist in some ways. And we wanted to test this concept. So we're collecting data on things like population density as far back as 1500, the last 100 years, how many times has your nation been potentially invaded, natural disasters, and so forth. And the idea, by the way, is pretty simple. When you have a lot of threat, you need stricter rules to coordinate. You need to prevent people from defecting and causing even more chaos. So that's the kind of general theory. And that's what we saw in this study. This is sort of just looking at correlations controlling for GDP and other factors. We see that there's a connection between having high density as far back as 1500, deprivation, disasters, threat, and pathogen prevalence. I want to mention that this is not a modern phenomena. We went back, partnered with anthropologists. This was a great study with Carol Ember, who manages the Human Relation Area Files, these very rich texts of ethnographies that you can code for the degree of norm strength in pre-industrial societies. And it was, a long project because these are very rich texts. We got to get integrated reliability from our RAs, coding tight loose in the ethnographic record. And what we did in this study is we coded various domains of life. These ethnographies all talk about law and ethics, socialization, gender, marriage, sexuality, funerals, et cetera. And we wanted to see, is there a coherent underlying factor using factor analysis, or are societies kind of random in their tight loose? And what we found is, you could just see on average funerals were much stricter across these samples. But we found an underlying latent factor of tight loose, so that some groups veered tight, like the Hutterites, others veered loose, like the Scott Laps. And we see the same connection between threat and those ratings in the pre-industrial societies. We found some other things, like they're also believing in moralizing gods, and we have a whole research program on tight loose and religion that I can get into details. So, okay, I want to just mention this pattern is also found in societies in the US 50 states when we code them for how tight and loose they are in terms of archival measures of constraint and latitude and survey measures. We see the same pattern of disasters, scarcity pathogens, and rural ratio where there's a lot of monitoring and the gossip mill that keeps people in place. I also will mention before I get to a question, which is better, tight or loose, I'm going to have you vote, that this is a dynamic construct. It changes over time, and we've been starting to develop some methods to do that. We partnered with some computational linguistic scholars, and we developed a new dictionary where we can track the sort of this construct over time in newspapers and Google News and so forth, and we can see that there's been a gradual loosening in the US according to this kind of dictionary approach. But even more interestingly, over the last 200 years, we can see that as this loosening has been happening, that we have more creativity, that's kind of the openness trade-off, but also we have, it predicts less order in terms of things like more truancy, more debt. So this is just another way to say that we can look at this as a dynamic construct. Okay, so I want to ask you which you think is better, tight or loose. If you had to vote for, either in organizing a society, I want to ask you how many people would vote for looseness?
For us or for everybody else?
Everybody. You're going to be living there. I got it. How many people vote for tightness? And how many people would abstain? I think it's a really classic question, an age-old debate about how do we organize societies. It's, should we have a lot of freedom, what I call looseness, permissiveness, or constraint? And, throughout history, we see people like Plato, Confucius, Hobbes clearly thought, humans need rules, voting for tightness. And we have, people like John Stuart Mill, Freud thought rules made people neurotic, arguing for looseness. And many other people, disciplines, have been really chiming in this debate. And I really started thinking about this and thought, maybe neither is correct. Maybe, groups need to veer tight or loose for good reasons, based on threat, based on other predictors, which I can mention, other things that predict this. But maybe the extremes are really the things we have to worry about. The groups that are either too tight or too loose. That applies to nations, it applies to organizations, it applies to households. By the way, I have a tight-loose mindset quiz on my website, so you can check out where you fall on this construct. I'm going to be truthful. I'm a moderately loose person, and my husband moderately tight. He's a lawyer, so he gets very disturbed by how I load the dishwasher and things like that. But in any event, this is a general principle. We call it the Goldilocks principle of tight-loose, and this suggests that we might see this curvilinear relationship between this construct and well-being. And I want to mention that Durkheim talked about this some years ago. He talked about societies that had a lot of fatalistic suicide that were just so repressive that they wanted to escape. But on the flip side, he talked about societies that have anemic suicide, anemy meaning normlessness, that really struggle with meaning and that want some sense of belonging that also commit suicide. And so we wanted to test that theory with more data. And this is what we see in a paper we published a couple of years ago. This is controlling for the main effect and controlling for other factors, that there's a curvilinear relationship between the construct and things like depression, suicide, blood pressure, happiness. By the way, it's also related to innovation in a curvilinear sense. You can imagine innovation involves both idea generation, but also implementation. And so you need both tight and loose to really have innovation. And we have a recent chapter, I'm going to send it to you, Ned, that looks at that. So, it is the case that some loose cultures are really creative, but they might not be able to scale up. In the Startup Nation in Israel, they argue that this is an issue with Israel compared to Singapore, where there's a lot of scaling up and maybe not as much idea generation. I want to mention the principle, kind of this balancing freedom of constraint question, I think applies to many different things we study and across levels. So in decision-making research, we know that if you have too little choice, people are very unhappy. But we also know that people given too much choice, this paradox of choice, really causes people to be indecisive and just stuck. So this is another way of thinking about this balance of tight and loose. It also, we know from the leadership literature that leaders that give too little discretion or are very autocratic, directive, produce followers that are very unsatisfied and unmotivated, but so do leaders that are really laissez-faire, who just give people a lot of autonomy. And even in the parenting literature, something that's close to my discipline, we know that this also applies. Research shows that overly strict parents that are, monitoring their kids all the time, these helicopter parents, produce maladaptive kids, but so do parents who are very lax. Their kids develop a lot of bad habits. And as parents, for me as an American parent, I wanted to lock my kids up for several years as teenagers. But, you have to find your Goldilocks. And, again, it depends on your sort of reference point might depend on things like threat. But nevertheless, these extremes we have to get concerned about. Let me just kind of get into this now more dynamic ambidexterity issue, which is what this suggests to us is that we need to really be harnessing the power of social norms. We need to be mindfully changing them as needed. So in that case, I would say we are trying to identify contexts where we need to loosen tight norms, but also maybe we need to tighten loose norms that are really maladaptive. And I think that's important because culture is not destiny. So I work with the U.S. Navy on the first issue. The Navy needs to veer tight. We don't want them to have all sorts of, loose norms in a context where there's a lot of coordination needs and threat. But at the same time, if we want to maximize that order-openness trade-off, they need to insert some discretion into that system, some flexibility. We call that flexible tightness. So I'm working with them on a grant where we're trying to figure out how to do that. But on the flip side, we also work with big social media companies who clearly need to tighten. We don't want to be China in terms of our monitoring on the internet, but we clearly have a problem with the wild, wild web. And I write about this in the book of how do we kind of do that. This is inserting some accountability into that system, some structure that helps to create some balance. Okay, I think you know where I'm going in terms of tight, loose ambidexterity, but let me just say this general principle of, trying to calibrate to levels of threat, is something that I think we've been writing about for a while. And more recently, during COVID, started to think about these kind of cultural evolutionary mismatches. You're probably wondering, when is she going to get to her title? And this is a concept that comes from evolutionary biology, which just basically is referring to when traits that have been really well adapted to an environment, when the environment changes, then those contexts can really struggle. And it's been applied to lots of things like obesity and alcoholism and gambling. And I started to think about this as more of a cultural evolutionary mismatch. And I want to describe really two, and I'm going to open up for questions. One is, groups not tightening when there is real threat. I think you can imagine where I'm going to go with that in a second. But the other is an opposite issue, which is groups tightening when there's actually not objective threat. And either of these have their problems. In the first case, we really have a problem with order and coordination and dealing with threat. In the second case, we have a problem with really a lack of openness. And sort of you see where those order-openness trade-offs would come to bear when they have these mismatches. So let me just mention that I talked about this in a recent Foreign Affairs fair, and I call it a failure of fear, the lack of tightening during collective threat. And I wrote an article for the Boston Globe in March 2020. I was actually on the plane to Breckenridge with my family, and I'm like, this is an uncoordinated mess already in the United States. And then I was writing about how, this theory about, tightening is really functional temporarily during collective threat. I also was thinking, well, maybe this is not going to be a problem because a lot of our computational models that we had published showed that when there's threat, the evolution of cooperation and punishment happens. So it was really something I thought, well, maybe like 9/11, we tightened. But then I thought, well, there's two things that are problematic here. One is that this is an abstract germ. Like we can rally around, norms when it's really tangible, like terrorism or conflict. But this is an abstract germ that's easy to avoid. It's psychologically abstract. Yakov Tropi has a theory about this. And so it's easier to ignore. And also, we were wondering we never tested whether loose cultures take longer to tighten under threat. So we started partnering with our evolutionary game theorists. This is a computational model where we're looking at, manipulating threat, and I can get into details in the Q&A, and looking at how fast it takes groups that are high on conformism versus not, and all the variants on that, how long it takes them to cooperate. And what you see here is that, the green line are loose groups in our models, and, they're taking a lot longer to cooperate, and they have lower alive rates in this simulation. But then we started getting data. So over time, we're collecting cases, deaths per capita, and we see a base correlation. This is by the late winter of 2020. This is now an expanded sample that we had on Tight Loose. This is pre-pandemic measures from 2019. And we see a pretty, decent correlation between tightness and cases per capita. Of course, culture is not the only thing in town. We want to control for everything in the kitchen sink to see, is this a robust effect? So we include testing per capita, which is an important indication of underreporting. We include GDP, Gini, population density, migrants, government efficiency, government response, also from Oxford's measures, other cultural dimensions, vaccination, authoritarianism. We include all these things, and you see there's a very robust effect of tightness. Same as with deaths, a little stronger effect. Here we also include the same controls, but we also include things like mortality pre-pandemic, like how unhealthy was a country. One of the most striking, I'm sure I'm going over time, but I'm going to come to a conclusion. One of the striking pieces of data we had from this study was we were tracking, this is not a huge sample, but it's representative samples from YouGov who were asking from the very first case in a country over time how scared people were of COVID. And so we were looking at what's the percentage of people who say they're very or somewhat scared that they will contract COVID. And what was astonishing is that tight cultures not only had more fear from the very beginning, but they sustained that level of fear, even though they were actually doing much better in terms of cases and deaths. So in a way, you can think that the threat signal got hijacked in loose cultures, and for a variety of reasons. Okay, so I want to just mention a couple of things, some of the lessons. One is that we need to kind of figure out how to make these kinds of threats more clear and concise and concrete. I think also the issue is reminding people that tightening is temporary. The faster we tighten, the faster we're going to reduce the threat. We have models that actually show that. And the faster we can have freedom. Some cultures got that right. They had the right level of ambidexterity. New Zealand's a good example. I mean, their Kiwis are famously loose in our data, but with good leadership and with people really enforcing the norms from bottom up. There were a lot of calls on hotlines in New Zealand telling people, like, everyone's got to follow the rules here. It's a tall poppy syndrome. You can't just stand out and do your own thing if we're in this together. So that relates to the final point on national identity, that clearly that's something we find correlated with tightness also. I want to mention the opposite evolutionary mismatch really quickly because it's just as important, which is kind of this, threat doesn't have to be real to tighten people's mindsets. And we've done this in the lab where we bring people in and we have fake threat, and we can see like people starting to kind of veer on the tightness mindset, having more of that order mentality and decrements on openness in terms of things like ethnocentrism, preferring strong leaders. I think you know where I'm going here. And in fact, right before the election, I should say that autocrats know about this psychology. They're in the business of actually threat psychology and tightening. And it has this evolutionary basis, which is why it's so powerful. And a lot of the narratives from Salvini, from Orban, they're all about, kind of threats. And their goal is to inspire and tighten groups. And I wrote about this during the primaries, and we showed that people's perceptions of threat, whether it was from immigrants or from ISIS or North Korea or other threats, actually was related to their desire for tighter rules. People who felt these threats thought the U.S. was too loose and going to a loose handbasket, whatever you call it. And that, in turn, was predicting their vote for Trump, above and beyond other things, including things like conservatism. And we also replicated this in France and wrote about it at the time. So I want to mention that one of the things here, I think that this suggests to us from a cross-cultural psych perspective, is that, we need to deal with objective threat. We know that. We know the working class has a lot of objective threat, and other countries are getting that issue. They're dealing with that much better, like in Germany, and I talk about that a lot in some of the writings. But we also have to deal with this exaggerated threat and this fake threat, and helping to bring people together in novel ways so that they can see that we have a shared humanity. And I have all sorts of projects on that, using daily diaries to try to expose people to each other's lives, and they tend to actually help reduce that kind of negative stereotyping of the outgroup. The last thing I'll say on this point is that, this is really a problem clearly on social media. We have all this fake threat, and it's really a huge problem. We have no idea how this is affecting our behavior, both individually and as a nation. And we don't, and this also, it's kind of a neuroscience perspective. A lot of people study this. I mean, it's really hijacking our brain circuitry. And we recently have started to develop a new threat dictionary, again, partnering with computational linguistics, to try to have a threat barometer, to see how much threat are you being exposed to, and what's the consequence of that? How contagious is it? And so this is a new dictionary that we've developed that I'd be happy to send around for people. It's in final review at PNAS right now. And we've been looking at its influence on cultural shifts over the last 100 years using newspaper data in the US, economic shifts like stock market behavior from like the early 30s up until now, and also political shifts. So I think I'll stop there. I'm not even sure how far at a time I am, because I just ignored this little box over here. But I'm happy to take questions. And this is the book that I would love you guys to check out. I also just want to say one other thing, which is that that PNAS has a new journal, which is called PNAS Nexus. I was telling some colleagues about it yesterday, and I'd love for you guys to submit to it, because it's a new sister journal to the Science Advances. Yeah.
So we have time, I'll just say for like one question. At the end, we can speak more, but we do have a remote speaker who's on the horn waiting, so.
Yeah, I was just, is this on? I was interested in how your work compares with Joseph Henrich's work, where I have a sense you've got one dimension, and his weird culture, it seems like it has a mixture of tightness and looseness.
Yeah, actually, it's a great question. The WEIRD acronym stands for Western Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic Nations. And we're good friends, and actually we share a quest to make psychology and other related disciplines less Western. And this has been something going on for a long time, but it's astonishing, that the field and organizational behavior, my sister field, is also extraordinarily Western. So some of his recent work draws on tight-loose theory and is looking at cultural distance on tight-loose, but also some other dimensions. But what we share also is just a cultural evolutionary kind of framework that, that was the Triandis training also, that there's not all cultural differences have that kind of logic, but we should try to understand the ecological, historical foundations of those differences to help people understand, why is it that you can't bring a large quantity of gum into Singapore? Like, Americans think that's preposterous. But it makes sense in some contexts of high density, especially where there could be potential conflict. So we share a lot of intellectual tradition together, and we're part of a lot of the same groups that navigate this terrain.
All right, I think we do have to move on to the next presentation. Thank you so much.
I'm in Helsinki, Finland, at my home studio, which is right above the flat where Pentti Kouri, our dear mutual friend, used to live when in Helsinki. And it was Pentti that introduced me to Ned's work. Me being a philosopher, was quite struck by the way Pentti perceived Ned, because the way he perceived Ned emphasized Ned as a kind of economist beyond economics. And it was this kind of meta level something in Ned that struck a chord in me, because as a philosopher, I had been long agonized by the fact that academic philosophy so easily becomes trapped into its own highly imaginative constructions. So as a result, the kind of contrast that sometimes one hears within the total function of a philosopher and something you could call a functionary, a contrast that is not often appreciated by academic philosophers, because most acknowledge themselves as functionaries, as opposed to somebody like Socrates, who represents the total function of a philosopher, somebody who reaches out with his intellectual acumen towards non-philosophers. So to me, Ned's work on mass flourishing pointed to something one could call perhaps the total function of an economist, as opposed to a functionary. Somebody who is thinking of economics, as opposed to somebody who is just thinking from within economics. That's not to say that Ned wouldn't have done groundbreaking work also in the latter respect. It's not to sort of dismiss the significance of anybody doing kind of from expert to expert kind of contributions. But Ned's work in mass flourishing, and I would say these conferences highlight this legacy in Ned, bring together people with the idea of finding new ways of comprehending, making sense of vital phenomena of economics. So Lauri Pietinalho, who is there, and I have done quite a lot of work into trying to make sense using some kind of meta language, probably not fitting any particular expertise or discipline, trying to make sense of some of the key contributions of Ned's that Lauri is going to share with you right there. I only acknowledge the fact that I think when you think about contributions from yesterday, the wide range of thinking that was put forward, the kind of contributions like Jeffries or Romans, you could say those definitely were in the realm of economists that want to reach out and want to think what economists are thinking beyond what economists in fact are thinking when they perform their expertise. So the effect of that would be, and here in Finland, where I've tried quite a bit over the years to bring forth Ned's ideas, I think to some extent this has brought fruition. The kind of aim towards passion for thinking wide and thinking wise, as Jeffrey yesterday put it. I think it's a legacy that we want to hold dear to our heart. So so with these words, all the best, and over to you, Lauri.
Thank you, Esa. I'm very honored to be here and get to talk about Ned's theory to all of you. So one of the central motivations for this conference throughout the decades it's been arranged, and questions in the work of Ned Phelps, I find, has been how dynamism, mass flourishing, and the good economy, in the sense that Phelps defines them, become engendered. With this presentation, with the essay behind it, I hope to offer a viewpoint to this question and to contribute to Ned's theory. The argument is a part of a more generic one in my dissertation that I hope to defend early next year. With that, I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Ned and Viviana for supporting the project over the years. Now, I will first start by laying out what I see as the fundamental elements of Ned's of the Phelpsian theory, as I see them, to give context for the argument. I will then discuss the actual argument, and then finally some implications for that alternative perspective in modernity and in the world that we see today. I must warn you, I'm purposefully simplifying a lot, and the argument is it's a bit on the same realm as Michel's, but completely or almost completely conceptual. So I'm looking forward to hear what you how you view it. So first, the recap of Phelpsian theory, the way I see it. So it's a theory of it's a Phelpsian theory of the economy. It's kind of a three-part or four-part theory, and it has considered the roots of indigenous innovation, of economic dynamism, of mass flourishing, and societal values with it. But I essentially see it all comes from this one singular vision of how the economy at its best works. So a central motivation for and the ontological lens of Phelps' analysis of the economy is human experiencing. Drawing particularly from modernist philosophers and from Aristotle, Phelps concludes that people have an innate drive for creation, for self-expression and exploration. And being able to experience and live that drive is elemental for good life. It is not an empty obsession of gathering experiences, but an internal drive to create and see creations take place. The essence of the theory is, I find, that it aims to explain the logic through which an economy might systematically and organically engender a landscape for such experiencing. Now, regarding the general logical theory of Phelps' theory, this drive is the source of innovation that then actually moves the world, or can move the world. Innovation that moves the world, according to Phelps, requires novelty that cannot be forced by just adding more effort, nor, quote, driven by the keen observations, fortunate sightings, or experienced judgments, end quote. Instead, it requires having a vision, courage, and patience to attentively endeavor and experiment toward such visions, not proved or approved by others. Now this, of course, is a crude simplification, but the theory, I find, portrays dynamism or this kind of economy as self-sustaining. The exploitative and creative drive is an innate property of human nature that then leads to innovation. Groundbreaking innovation then fuels dynamism as others hurry to adapt and deploy the innovations in different contexts. And ongoing dynamism of the surrounding economy provides inspiration and stimulation for subsequent exploration. Ultimately, the whole dynamic in the theory comes down to how societal values support human drive to explore and create. Now, in his work, Phelps has focused on how the values characteristic of modern economies were manifested along dynamism and innovation back then. I am keen on offering a complementary, perhaps a more general perspective to the relationship of societal values and Phelpsian dynamism. So the human drive to explore and create is, of course, a deeply personal aspect in us. Our aptitude to engage with the world in such ways is highly dependent on our immediate relational experiences now and in the past. However, here we are interested on how and when would such drives be fostered more systematically in society. Now, I consider societal values here as shared considerations and appreciations that consciously and subconsciously guide the members of society on how one is to behave, what to strive for, what aspects to consider when making decisions in order to be successful or even accepted. Essentially, my point here is societal values can guide the human drive to explore only indirectly. So I'll start with sort of considering the place within us that such Phelpsian exploration arises. That is the deep human element in the Phelpsian theory that Esa actually has always focused on in his talks and elsewhere. Essentially, the kind of engagement with our social reality that is required to break new ground for that social reality eludes mere cognitive choice. I cannot just choose to be courageous and trust my faith in the unknown, or I can, but then I'm actually more focused on me appearing as courageous than being interested and driven by what I do. Which means that I'm not engaged in the kind of exploration that we talk about here. I actually believe that John Dewey referred to this relationship of exploration and creation and the labels of outside appreciations or societal values when he discussed, quote unquote, the function of the mind. For him, inherent in humans was, or is, quote, to project new and more complex ends, to free experience from routine and from caprice, end quote. However, according to Dewey, this projection cannot be guided by labels, even of high ideals. In this way, societal values or norms, regardless of what they are kind of by definition impeding to any true exploration and breaking of new ground, even if the labels of those ideals would be breaking new ground or progression. All of such tend to become attached to certain manifestations or appearances of attempting the new or of progression. Finally, in the same spirit, the whole notion of Phelpsian exploration is defined as going against and paving the way beyond established appreciations and the logic of doing things, moving beyond the prevailing social construction. I find Ned discusses this idea particularly by often pointing to the difference between risk and Knightian uncertainty, which we also heard Roman do yesterday. Now, for these reasons, the way to see societal values as fostering exploration, I find, is through an undefined space that they leave in between them. Now here, I refer to David Sidorsky, who wrote a beautiful paper on value plurality in the Journal of the Center about 10 years ago. One of the points, or one of the central points I read him making is the necessity of incompatible and dissonant values in a quote-unquote good society. But here, however, this kind of space in between established values or societal values, does not ultimately result from a plurality of values. When the sphere of considered aspects, even if originally involving contradictions, remains constant, our deliberations start to have known ends and become mechanical, no matter what the scope of the performed end, as Dewey said. Instead, the new uncharted space is formed only through the emergence of new societal values that contradict the presuppositions of a prevailing dogma in a new way. Now here we land, or what we land on is what we end up calling meta-dynamics of values, even though it is kind of mouthful. Instead of to any specific values per se. So we have even had the courage to almost formalize this point. Because the story is not that simple, though. The dynamism would be always, or would just be about the rise of new values. There's some other conditions for that. But the conditions actually are not about the content of those values, but the dynamics and the contrast between the values. So as I consider there are certain these boundary conditions. So first of all, as discussed, new societal values rise that challenge the prevailing dogma. But these values are initially inexplicable from the perspective of the prevailing dogma. That you can derive them. It's created as a new kind of opposition for that dogma. But importantly, also the prevailing dogma remains to provide contrast to this emergence of those new values. And then finally, and I find this is the process of dynamism, that when connections emerge in the uncharted space between the originally, inexplicable, in the paradigm or in the paradox between the new values and the prevailing dogma. And it's this action that then liberates action to Phelpsian vitality, and also eventually would end up dissolving the prevailing dogma, or it would morph into something else. So this emerging space invites exploration, because there's some idea of the size of the space, but not the depth of it. Actually, a little bit on what Michel said about having some form, but not, but also freedom. Because there's no preconceived rules for what answers are right in that space. No one has clear answers on how to act. So it's precisely this kind of expansion that entails ambiguity, excitement, and a plethora of unanswered questions, and particularly wholly new ways of reasoning that fuel dynamism. So notably, these conditions are here for a reason, because since I try to rule out evolution and revolution of societal values that do not prime this emerging new space. There's a lot of such, new values too. So a lot of new values might seemingly be new, but actually do not contradict prevailing dogmas very much, but just modify and often effectively further narrow the landscape of action. Also, this kind of expansion of space does not occur when we merely select and fully move into some set of new values, like what happens when a sect separates themselves from the rest of the society, or when a country adopts a monist set of harmonious values, which Sidorsky's examples mainly come from. Since then, we separate ourselves from the contrast that actually creates the new space. Similarly, a new uncharted space is not engendered when values of nostalgia are introduced that would seem to liberate from the ills of a prevailing dogma, but because those such values are driven by a close-ended image of certain answers, not a new set of questions. Now, if we then a few implications of this perspective. If we take this proposition to be somewhat correct, there's well, first, kind of directly to Ned's point about the modern economies, I would put it that dynamism in modernity, from this lens, would be attributed to liberation and vitality brought about by allowing for individualism and self-expression in the context of traditional communal values and structures, rather than to the ideals of individualism in isolation. Phelps sees that dynamism in the US, for example, eroded about 1960s and 70s. It's also the time when many considered that the traditional communal structures and values were finally rendered empty with the introduction of postmodernity. Individual became, quote-unquote, unrestrained, as, for example, Professor Richard Rupp described in his conference some years ago. In the language of my thesis here, individualism remained in the context of itself, and there is no liberation by individualism from individualism. Kind of a more general point is that such a period of dynamism that Phelps describes kind of only comes with the fundamental change in the prevailing societal values. That it's not something that we can actually engender within the dogmas we would like to see them. And then finally, a point that has been made here in this conference multiple times. Taking this abstracted lens of what is happening now, it would seem to fit almost too well to what took place in the modern economies. This time it's the emergence of a consciousness of a planetary and social crisis that can be seen to have all the hallmarks of the seeds of Phelpsian dynamism, if we see the seeds in this way. So what we're experiencing now, and it juxtaposes the established values and conventions of economic action and organizing with the imperative to have a positive impact on society and on the planet. But there are no answers or established models in that space. It provides liberation for the main ills of our economic life at the moment, which many have suffered from for years, meaning meaninglessness within the now very narrow dogma of individualism and instrumental rationalism. It truly invites and calls and requires innovation from everyone and in very new ways, including societal, institutional, as well as market innovation and entrepreneurship. The remarks made in this room both point out and themselves manifest this change of values, like those from Jeffrey and Rana yesterday. There are new connections that are being discussed between the old and new paradigm in a very concrete manner that did not happen only a few years ago. Now, someone who hastily reads the Phelpsian theory would say this analogy doesn't make sense, since the period that Phelps describes is affected with the era that is the root of the current planetary crisis. But we have to remember that the core of the Phelpsian theory is not about growth or wealth accumulation, but it's about dynamism and people driving change beyond what seems possible. Thank you.
We can take one or two questions, maybe?
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I'm worried about that. The third space, which you note as a place of creativity and innovation, but I can equally see it go in another way, like the state of emergency that Carl Schmitt writes about. So I'm wondering if you have any criteria for dynamism that would move towards sort of a truer liberation rather than a dictatorship. Dictatorship. That's what Carl Schmitt talks about. This third space as being seized by the dictator in order to gain control. And I just see that there's an agnosticism in your presentation about what counts as as an innovation that's going to be positive and liberating for all, as opposed to something else. It could easily go both ways.
Yes, so I tried to, since I noticed that there's that trap exists in the argumentation, for myself that is, but I tried to make that distinction with the point 2, I think, and it's whether those new values are driven by answers or questions. Because typically, the more narrow, or where dictators would rise, is a certain set of answers that they provide. Whereas it's more opportunity and questions that have characterized, or what I think would characterize emergence of values that has potential for dynamism. Because it's exactly in the space where there are no answers that we go as a result of then applying those new set of values in what exists. Often the more narrow dogmas just try to move away from what exists and then implement a certain monist set of answers. Would be my answer.
Hi, I am an aspiring philosopher,
Me too.
and I'm struck by the way your presentation really tracks Thomas Kuhn's account of scientific change, which is, of course, a kind of dynamism, the growth of scientific knowledge. And you didn't mention Kuhn, although you use the word paradigm, but everyone does that these days, and Kuhn didn't even like the word anymore himself. So I just wonder if Kuhn is kind of back there, or if you have Kuhn integrated into your analysis in any way.
No, not explicitly, but obviously this logic of paradigms would be present here too. Roman?
I actually wanted to ask the same question, but I'll frame it differently. You see, the essence of night is this kind of creativity. And if I understand what you said correctly is, and which I think is the key, is that things have to arise from a context. They do not become free-floating, which is the essence of Kuhn, is the essence of what you were saying. So basically, the creativity comes from the new arrangement of all things, and the new things arrive in that context. That's the baseline. And Knight had an incredible way of thinking about economics, which is the key to actually doing economics in an open world like this. He said, this is an incredible insight, he said that the economic problem is solved when the future is like the past, which is what current economics is. There is no economics when the future is like the past. But the problem of economic knowledge is, the difficulty with economic knowledge is that the future is different than the past. So the future has to resemble the past, but cannot be the replica of the past. That's the phrase I use, that it's not a probabilistic replica of the past. And that's exactly the framing in which we can operate without, in your philosophical language, being alienated, because we actually do understand the base where against which the innovation occurs. And now, speaking of the authoritarianism question, the key question on authoritarianism was actually answered by Popper, that we do need to have an open system, which is exactly what authoritarians, by proposing finite solutions for close, precisely because that's the only way in which we can have dynamism in this sense. So that's the fight.
I would agree. I think Richard has it.
Okay, one more.
was a wonderful presentation. I just want to say congratulations to ESSA for producing such a student. It's uplifting about the future. And I also would just like to add how moved I am to see the legacy of David Sidorsky at our conferences being remembered and recognized, because I think it's just fantastic papers that, you know, one hopes that they didn't catch fire at the beginning, but one hopes it's the sort of thing that over time will build momentum and be remembered. So thank you for that. I haven't phrased this in the form of a question.
All right, so I think we will need to end there. Thank you both very much. Thank you, Essa. So our next speaker is also virtual, so we'll pull him up now. Okay, Jean-Paul, we can see and hear you now. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you have the floor.
I have a floor already. Thank you very much. Thank you to have invited me, and I am sorry not to be with you because of a ban put by the American government. I will present to you work in progress, where I have already written a book, and it is about a very peculiar subject. It's the language and the influence of a language on economic policy and on social policy. I am using in all that work the word that the Newspeak, according the terminology of George Orwell, that the Newspeak has erased. Erasing a word is like throwing away books and amputating our ability to make ourselves understood with a million of combinations. Nothing can justify it. It is a violence to be deprived of a concept to express one's thought. A shrink. And the great communicator had understood this. Orwell, of course, but before him, Goebbels. And the impoverishment of the language allows thought to converge. This is how we can finally understand what some expressions, which were bizarre, like pensée unique in France, unique thought, or like the Washington Consensus in the US, or mainstream economics, we can understand what is the purpose of this shrinking of a language in this proof of trying a new theory. And the problem that is essential to this process is that impoverishing the language allows the convergence of the thinking. And Goebbels was saying that he is not willing that people think like him, but he wants to impoverish the language in such a way that people can't do otherwise but to think like him. It is through the mediation of the language that everything passes and happens. But the word can be a problem, even for the best communication. For example, you can have a financial crisis, which implies that the newspeak has to be changed in an urgent way, or you can have a COVID crisis where the newspeak should be changed also in a very urgent way to be audible by the people. And what is happening then is that the great communicator proceed changing their word as if nothing had happened. For example, they will pass in one breath from the necessity of rigor to the necessity of deficit, or as did happen in some country in Europe, I don't know, in the US, to the absolutely unnecessity of a mask to the absolute necessity of a mask. So they will go from one extreme to the other without saying that they have changed their vocabulary, because they hope that at the end, the reason will come back and the whole situation will again prevail. And that means that the newspeak is here for a long time. For example, the world has gone through really radically different events: German unification, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of Soviet Union, the financial crisis, the COVID crisis, and so on and so forth. And we are still using the same language as far as political economy is concerned to try to understand what is going on. So I am coming to the conclusion that in actuality, we are no more understanding very well the world around us. Our language is too poor to understand it. And on the field of fact, we have not solved a lot of problems, socially, economically, and politically. So to try to understand this enigma, the great science fiction authors like ours are of great help. In 1984, Orwell described a process that Big Brother has set up to make society converge toward the official thought. There is a commissioner of the code, which is define the party line, which define the party line, and the Ministry of Truth, which is charged of a consistency of a language, of a consistency of a message, which the government wants to pass now with history. So this ministry is rewriting the old book so as they are consistent with the new book. So we are, seems to me, not very far from this picture of word of language that Orwell is giving. We are not very far without coercion, of course, but through method of persuasion, media control, repetition, and social sanction that encourage self-censorship. The atmosphere of courtesanship and the spirit of propaganda that characterize certain media bear witness to the road already traveled. And think to the cancel culture or to the woke movement. It's exactly what is at stake. It is political economy that will serve for illustration of my point. One of the stratagems used by the Newspeak, I know that I will meet contradiction on this point. One of the stratagems used by the Newspeak in this field is to have flattened time in order to create from the outset an ambiguity about the chronology of theoretical contribution. Neoclassical theory, Keynesian theory, etc., etc. But what is clear is that this flattening of time, seems to me, has allowed to invert the time arrow, putting classical theory as the modern theory and Keynesian theory as the archaic theory. That means as if the 30s preceded the 20s. The curiousm is that among this set of theory, only the Keynesian theory is explaining unemployment. Neoclassical theory is not. And we know the reason why. Many contributions have been done by authors in this room. And despite this, neoclassical theory has won the intellectual battle. Has won the intellectual battle because it has reconstructed itself in an elegant way, using with care mathematical language. And so the aesthetic of it is much better than the one of Keynesian theory. But that does not change anything. It does not change the fact that Keynesian theory was succeeding neoclassical theory, not the contrary. The rest follow from this. The Keynesian word has a pejorative connotation and refer to a retarded teenager or to an economist insufficiently trained in mathematics. And what is clear from that and the importance of that is for the evolution of discipline. It is very difficult for a professor to give as a thesis, the subject of a PhD, a Keynesian question, because it will not help the career of the student. So that means that there is in this evolution something which will lengthen the evolution of our discipline. And despite that, for example, Gregory Mankiw, which was once president of the Council of Economic Advisors, said that in a paper called The Scientist and the Engineer, that despite all that, economic policy is still governed by Keynesian theory, not by neoclassical theory. But that is in the United States. In Europe, it's a bit different. In Europe, it is a bit different because, and especially because, the European construction has grounded the economic policy on rules rather than discretion. And so there is no way of handling economic policy instrument because they are freezed by rules. In fact, this rule prevents the use of policy instruments. So in this context, the Newspeak will deploy its power in two directions. The first is to convince us that everything has been done to solve the haunting problem we face: unemployment, precariousness, inequality. Unfortunately, nothing has worked. And of course, nothing can't work in a context where you can use the policy instrument only in a homeopathic way. And by dint of repeating this, we become convinced that nothing will solve any of our problems. And it is unfortunate, but we can't mourn the impossible. The second direction is more concrete. It is saying that the problem we are confronting are, in fact, the responsibility of the population, not of the government. The population is resisting reforms. I mean, in Europe, the population is resisting the reform, the unemployed, like the poor, do not want to move to alleviate the burden that they put on society. We reject wage cuts as well as pension reform, unemployment compensation reform, labor law reform. In short, all the changes where we live fever. The time has come to ask ourselves what we can do for our country. And what is the result of that? In actuality, we have done a lot of reform in Europe. We have passed not really, they have not have been observed, but they exist. And we have done a lot of reform. But after 1,000 reforms, we have not solved the problem we are confronted to. So what the result of all that is to say to the population, we have not gone that far to solve a problem. We are still not arrive to the point where the reform process can solve our problem. In this context, it is in this context that the Newspeak expression, the end of work, seems to sound the death knell for the remuneration of work, leaving only the respite that structural reform would allow. It may also be thought that its evocation only served to make the above-mentioned reform to be implemented at the detriment of the bargaining power of wage earner, and so to the detriment of a wage level. But the end of work is a fairly strange hypothesis, probably prompted by our ancestral fear of technical progress. Since it is strange, since it could also lead to a world of abundancy, as in Keynes' economic perspective for our grandchildren. The increase in productivity due to technical progress will allow our grandchildren to be 8, 12, whatever times richer than us, so as to solve the economic problem. So in one representation of this Newspeak, we have the end of work. In another, we have the end of the economic problem. So what is clear in Europe is that there is still impediment to economic policies. And this impediment to economic policy comes from the doctrine as it has been rephrased by the Newspeak. Thank you very much.
We have some time for a question or two, if we have any. Jean-Paul, you won't be able to see everyone, but you'll be able to hear whoever speaks. Minute.
That was fascinating, thank you. I'm not quite sure how this fits in, but I have been listening to a lot of analysis of voting pattern, and one of the things that's coming up is that people vote their anger. And what we are hearing in so much of the media is a deliberate stoking of anger. And I felt a bit in the Newspeak, this is seems to be part of what it is, but I'm trying to see how that fits in with the economic paradigm that you're speaking of.
You mean the media?
Yeah, I mean, we are...
Media has a big part of this paradigm. A big part of this paradigm because they are in charge of kind of propaganda and of censorship of the debate by choosing the argument, by choosing the people, especially in the television. They are really having a kind of effect of propaganda for the idea they defend. If I look at the media in Europe now, and especially in France, where there will be a presidential election in April, they are all on the same track. They are all defending the same position. So what is incredible is that they are acting as if they have learned the Newspeak dictionary and they are repeating it to the public without any change between the different TV or between the different newspaper. There has been a phenomena which has shown this in a fairly clear way. It is the rise of a new candidate for the presidential election called Eric Zemmour. And Eric Zemmour now is considered as the bad guy of the scene by all the media. Maybe it is. Maybe he is the bad guy. But I mean, the fact that all the media are thinking the same is something which is difficult to accept. And by the way, the idea of working from the language came from the observation of the media and from their identity of view, even if they are supposed fairly different. I don't know if I answer your question.
Part of what I was getting at least I know the US media, whether it is Fox News on the right, or CNN, MSNBC, this 24-hour news cycle, they are all, and probably it's the selection of who is on the show, they are all stoking this rising anger among the population, which also fits in with Professor Gelfand's discussion and the discussion we had yesterday on Europe. And it is Newspeak in the 1984 context that is really changing the entire way people are relating to each other and the way they think about each other. And the real question gets back to, does society survive? If we're all at each other's throats.
I mean, if a society can survive to this effort of the media, I am rather asking me what will be the fate of democracy if all this impoverishment of language, all this exaggeration of language by some media, if all that is not actually killing democracy. And the impression I got in observing both the US and Europe is almost the same, is that democracy begin to have a problem. And inequality impinge a lot on the problem of democracy, because as Socrates said, you can have in a country or a few rich, the wealth concentrated in a few hands, or you can have democracy, but you can't have both.
Jean-Paul, we know that the Newspeak dictionary is the only one that gets smaller every year, but I think there's a new entry, at least in the European version, of structural reform. Would that be, how would you feel about that?
Yeah, structural reform is the, the main entry of the European construction. And why? Because it is consistent with the fact that you have some sovereignty left to the nation. The structural reform has to be done by the countries of Europe. But the country of Europe have no instrument, no macroeconomic instrument to lead the policy. So what the structural reform in this Newspeak dictionary is telling to the people is that, in a way, as sovereign people, they are responsible of what is is the fate of the country. It is as if the Newspeak has taken the say of Kennedy. Don't ask what the country can do for you. Ask you what you can do for the country. And structural reform is asking to people sacrifices to resolve their own problem. For example, as I said, a decrease of unemployment benefit, decrease of wage, and a decrease of health expenditure, of which we have seen the consequences with the COVID crisis. So you are perfectly right, Richard.
Okay, I think we will end there. Thank you very, very much, Jean-Paul.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So 5 minutes, maybe let's take that 5, and we'll start right on time at 12:20. Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started again. If you could take your seats. As soon as we're all seated, we will get started again. All right, Professor Hill, why don't you go ahead and get started?
Okay, folks. So one of the great advantages of being up here, and probably the only one as far as I can see, is I can take my mask off. Huge sense of relief as soon as I took that mask off. I'm sure you share the feeling. I've given my talk the title, Why Haven't We Made More Progress on Climate? But that's not actually a terribly good title. A better title would be some collection of thoughts provoked by what's been happening in Glasgow over the last week or so. And one of the issues I'll be talking about is the one which is in the title there, but it's one of several. In the process of the talk, I'll actually be picking up, slightly surprisingly actually, picking up some points that Eric Maskin was talking about in his extremely lucid talk about voting yesterday. And I'll also be picking up some points that Richard Sennett was talking about in the dinner talk yesterday. And I'll actually also be picking up a point, and this surprises me even more, that Greta Thunberg, according to this morning's Guardian, was making in Glasgow yesterday as well. So let me start off by taking the title literally and talking about why we haven't made more progress on climate change. Now, there's a bunch of very obvious answers to that. I want to talk about a rather less obvious one. And the obvious ones are these ones here. The power of the fossil fuel lobby. You know, we've got a Democratic Congress, we've got a Democratic president, but we've got a senator for West Virginia who's paid a lot of money by the fossil fuel lobby and is still capable of blocking everything. You know, the fossil fuel lobby even today has more power apparently than the US president does. And that's been the case for decades. I mean, the extent to which the fossil fuel lobby has managed to misinform the public and to effect legislation or block legislation has been very well documented by a number of writers. So that's not something I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the fact that actually the economics profession, which is very well represented in this room here, has actually not pushed as hard as it might have done, to put it mildly, for action on the climate front. And a very good example of this is given by the reception that the Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change got when it was published in 2006. For those of you who are not in the field, Nick Stern is a very distinguished British economist. And back in, I think it was 2006, he wrote a thing called the Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change. At that point, he was the chief economic advisor to then Prime Minister Tony Blair. And the Stern Review made a strong economic case for rapid and prompt action to mitigate carbon emissions and for rapid action on climate change. Now, the review's reception, particularly by the sort of economics establishment in this country, was extremely hostile. That's probably putting it mildly, actually. Bill Nordhaus, who's a very distinguished guy at Yale, wrote that the review's unambiguous conclusions about the need for extreme immediate action will not survive the substitution of assumptions that are consistent with today's marketplace real interest rates and savings rates, which is basically a way of saying that Stern was using the wrong discount rate. And I'll come back to that and spend a bit of time on that later on. He goes on to say, one of the major findings in the economics of climate change has been that efficient or optimal economic policies to slow climate change involve modest rates of emission reductions in the near term, which obviously is a very controversial point in the present context. I mean, very few people would agree with that right at the moment. And Many other prominent economists agreed with Nordhaus on this. Marty Weitzman, that was then at Harvard, wrote in the same issue of the Journal of Economic Literature, criticizing the Stern Review on somewhat different grounds, but still criticizing it. So why was there this big disagreement about the need to take prompt action in mitigating climate change? There are two kind of conceptual obstacles here. One was the difficulty in modeling the damages resulting from climate change. And the second was disagreements about the discount rate. And that's probably the larger of the two. Let me just emphasize the importance of the discount rate. We discount present future benefits relative to the present, and the rate at which we discount those is a very important variable when you're looking at benefits and costs which are stretched out over very long periods of time. If you're looking 5 or 10 years ahead, the choice of the discount rate is not crucial. If you're looking 100, 150, 200 years ahead, which is typically what you are doing in climate change, the choice of a discount rate is absolutely critical. So in the bottom bullet point there, I've just given you some illustrations. The present value of $100 1 century ahead is $0.76, 76 cents at a 5% discount rate. But if you shift the decimal point on the discount rate by 1 and make it 0.5% discount rate, then the other value is $60. So if you shift the decimal place 1 on the discount rate, you shift the decimal place 2 on the resulting present value. So the present value is enormously sensitive to the value of the discount rate you choose. And it happened that Stern, in his review, picked a discount rate which was closer to 5%, to 0.5%, whereas Nordhaus characteristically works with a discount rate which is closer to 5%. And you can see that alone would result in huge differences in the emphasis they place on events in the future. Now, I come back. I'm going to talk first about modeling climate damages, but I'll come back to this point about the discount rate. And let me just make it very clear at the beginning that I'm not claiming that either of these people are right or wrong. I'm not saying that Stern is right and Nordhaus is wrong or vice versa. I'm actually going to argue that they both have quite legitimate positions and that we need to find a way of making decisions in the light of that fact. And I'll talk about how we can do that. So just let me make some brief remarks about climate damages. As I said, there really isn't a lot of general agreement on the costs to the economy of extensive climate change. There's a set of things called integrated assessment models, which are computerized models that essentially integrate a model of the economy, a very simple sort of growth model of the economy, with a very basic model of the climate system. And there's feedback between the two, so the active action of the economy generates climate change, which in turn affects the economy again. And Bill Nordhaus, one of his claims to fame, he has many claims to fame incidentally, is that he was the first person to develop these integrated assessment models effectively. Now these integrated assessment models, a critical part of these models is what's called the damage function. And that's the functional form which represents how a change in temperature affects the economy and society in general. And one of the weakest links in all of these models is these damage functions. We really don't understand very well how temperature affects the economy. And as a result, the damage functions are essentially based on what I personally would call casual empiricism. I mean, the authors of the models wouldn't want to use that phrase, obviously, but I think that's not a totally unfair comment. Sometimes there's an emerging econometric literature, a statistical literature on the effect of climate change on the economy, looking at what effect climate change to date has had on the economy. But because the climate has only changed by a relatively small amount, global mean surface temperature has gone up by about 1 degree in the last 50 years. So that's not a very big change. So it doesn't give you an awful lot of data points. But we're interested in knowing what would happen if the global mean surface temperature went up by 4 degrees, 5 degrees. And that involves extrapolating a very, very long way out of sample. So the margin of error on that is absolutely huge. So it's not particularly easy to get good estimates of the damages from climate change. Bob Pindyck, who's a prominent economist at MIT, has made some fairly trenchant comments in the Journal of Economic Literature about these integrated assessment models. And I've got a couple of them here. He says, integrated assessment models have crucial flaws that make them close to useless as tools for policy analysis. And they tell us nothing about the most important driver, the possibility of a catastrophic climate outcome. And a lot of economists actually agree with Pindyck. I mean, these models are not, I think to say that they're useless as tools for policy analysis is probably fair. They're not useless, though. I mean, you can carry out conceptual experiments with these models, and they're interesting in that context. You can get kind of general qualitative impacts from them, but it's hard to get quantitative impacts and believe in the numbers precisely. So let me flip from that to talking about discounting, which is the main topic I want to talk about. There's two traditional approaches to picking a discount rate. And as I said earlier, the choice of a discount rate is critically important here. One is to consult the market, take a discount rate from the market. And that's what Nordhaus was saying you ought to do in that quote I had from him up in a couple of slides back. And this is the approach which is most widely used by governments. So the US government consciously picks a discount rate. OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, picks a discount rate which is in some way related to market discount rates. The alternative approach is to imagine what we might call a benign planner, whose job is to make intertemporal allocation decisions, considering the interests of all generations, present and future. The benign planner is specifically briefed to take into account not only our interests today, but those of all future generations. And then ask, what would such a benign planner choose, given a reasonable ethical framework for making such choices? And that's probably the default in academia. This is the framework which was set up with the first ever paper on growth theory, a paper by a guy called Frank Ramsey, who wrote in Cambridge in the 1920s. He wrote a very famous paper called A Mathematical Theory of Saving in 1928. This is the framework that Ramsey set up there, and it's been universally used ever since then. So let me talk briefly about both of these approaches. The market rate first. So markets are supposed to synthesize individual preferences and tell us something about what the common factors in individual preferences. That's supposed to be reflected in market prices. Now, there are a lot of assumptions have to hold for that to be the case. One critical assumption here is that everybody whose preferences are relevant has to be participating in the market. If we're talking about things happening in 2050, 2060, 2100, that's clearly not the case. A lot of the key players, future generations, are just not represented in the market. So it's, I think, a mistake to think that a market existing today can fairly represent the interests of future generations there. Then there's a huge range of market imperfections that prevent markets from revealing the, quote, right, unquote, rate of time preference. Now, there is an argument that if, and as I said, under very stringent conditions, markets can give you useful information about how to value the future relative to the present, based on a kind of a synthesis of individuals' choices in this respect. But those conditions include, for example, that you have a complete set of what we call a complete set of futures and contingent markets. It means, for example, that you can trade today goods for delivery in all future periods, including future periods towards the end of the century. Now, we do have futures markets, and you can trade today goods for delivery 5 or 10 years ahead, but you certainly can't trade for delivery goods 50 or 60 years ahead. So that's what we call an incompleteness in the existing market structure. The other big omission here is the existence of externalities, external effects. When a transaction between, say, me and Joe there has an impact on third parties. That's what we call an external effect. And Nick Stern described, I think quite rightly, climate change as the greatest external effect in human history. So when you have incomplete markets, when you have externalities, then the market no longer actually conveys an accurate signal about the rate of time preference. So this is an equation. You don't need to know the details of this equation here. This is what's called the Ramsey rule, going back to that guy Ramsey I spoke about. And it tells you that the rate at which you might want to discount the future is equal to the return on capital, which is an observable parameter in capital markets. So under the whole range of very strict conditions I've just mentioned, there is a connection between observable data in capital markets and the rate at which you might wish to discount future costs and benefits. I say might, because there's a number of arguments for and against that. If, however, you introduce climate change and you modify the model so as to take account of the kinds of factors that integrated assessment models do, which is that temperature is affected by economic activity and damage, the result is a damage to the economy, which is roughly what that first equation there is saying, then you get, instead of that equation we had just now, you get this one. And the terms in red are terms which are not in the previous equation. It's the bottom line here is that, I'm not going to try and explain what this equation says, but the bottom line is it's a very different equation. And you can no longer read off the appropriate discount rate from market observable parameters. in order to calculate the appropriate discount rate from market observable parameters, you have to know a lot of other things, which we typically don't know, about exactly how the climate system responds and about exactly how the climate system affects the economic system. So markets in general will give an inaccurate signal in that situation. And there's a bunch of other reasons, which I haven't got time to go into, why one would doubt the value of market signals anyway. So let me talk instead about the benign planner approach. So the benign planner approach is typically a very utilitarian approach. You maximize the present value of the sum of utilities over some planning horizon. This requires that we pick certain key parameters. One key parameter is the discount rate, which is always represented by delta. The other one is something called the elasticity, represented by eta there, which is essentially a measure of your preference for equality over inequality. And both of these are very controversial parameters. There's no general agreement on what these are. There is, for example, a strong constituency for setting delta equal to 0, which means you treat future generations exactly like present generations. And in fact, Ramsey in his original paper made this rather unambiguous comment here. He said, discounting of future utilities is ethically indefensible and arises purely from a weakness of the imagination. What an obiter dicta. His brother went on to become head of the Church of England. And you can see that coming out in a sermon, can't you? Harrod, who was a contemporary of Frank Ramsey, said, discounting is a polite expression for rapacity and the conquest of reason by passion. Pigou, who was essentially the founder of environmental economics, said rather more moderately, it implies that our telescopic faculty is defective. And a contemporary, or almost a contemporary of ours, Bob Solow, said that in solemn conclave assembled, so to speak, we ought to act as if the social rate of time preference were 0. So there's a lot of very prominent people saying we ought to pick a 0 discount rate. We ought to treat future generations like we treat the present generation. But actually, if you try and do that, it turns out that implies an enormously high savings rate, very unreasonably high savings rate. And one of my great heroes, Ken Arrow, went on to say, what I think is the definitive statement on this. He said, I therefore conclude that the strong ethical requirement that all generations be treated alike, itself reasonable, contradicts a very strong intuition that it is not morally acceptable to demand excessively high savings rates of any one generation or even every generation. So there's sort of, Ken is saying there's a kind of a contradiction, an inherent contradiction here. And that point has been proved formally, actually, by a guy called Peter Diamond at MIT and by some other people. Let me skip that. And the key point, let me just focus on this red line here. Ramsey's paper is now almost 100 years old. We've been debating the correct values for delta and eta for 100 years. Well, actually, 92 years. And unfortunately, we still haven't agreed. And so the prospects of agreeing in the near future are probably rather small. So we need to find another way of dealing with this. And that's what I'm going to suggest. And that's why I'm going to pick up a point that Eric was making yesterday. And just to get us into, there are very important disagreements here. Let me just give you this diagram. This is from a survey of economists who've written on climate change, which asked them what they think are the correct values for delta and for eta. Each point is an economist or a group of economists, and the time preference is on the horizontal axis. The value for eta, the elasticity, is on the vertical axis. And you can see there are people who have, does this thing have a pointer? No. There are people who think, for example, that the right rate of discount is 8%, although a lot of people think the right rate of discount is 0. There are people who think that the right value of the elasticity is 6, and there are also people who think the right value for that is 0. If you take the difference between the guy who's at the origin there's one guy there at the origin who thinks that both numbers are 0. There's another guy who thinks that the right value for the discount rate is 6%, and the right value for the utility is, if the elasticity is 4%, is 4. If you take the difference between how they value $1 100 years from now, the answer is the ratio is 500,000 to 1. Really amazing difference, absolutely amazing difference. So there really is a lot of disagreement, unfortunately, within the profession about this. And what I've argued in a paper with co-author Anthony Milner is that we simply have to learn to live with these differences. That we have to recognize that people's choices of delta and eta are essentially parts of their value systems. There's no right or wrong answers on these, because these are ethical judgments, and there's no more a right or wrong answer on these than there's a right or wrong answer to the question, what's the right distribution of income? People can legitimately differ in their opinions on this. So we need to find a way of moving from differing values to an acceptable social choice, which is precisely the framework that Ken Arrow wrote about in 1953 in his book, Social Choice, Individual Values. There are several ways of doing this, and in the paper that I'm basing this on, we discussed this. I'm flipping through these rather quickly because I think I'm running out rather low on time. But essentially, one way of tackling this is to have people vote over this issue, which is where I'm picking up from Eric's comments yesterday, obviously. There's a variety of approaches to that, as Eric actually outlined yesterday, and we investigate a number of different alternatives here. In the process, incidentally, we pick up some ideas from a paper that was written by two people called Phelps and Pollack in 1968, Review of Economic Studies, Game Equilibrium Growth, a very profound paper and a very early paper in this area. So basically the earliest paper on Markov perfect equilibria. Very nice paper, incidentally, Ned, and we use some of the results in that. Anyway, so I haven't really got time to go into detail here, but we can actually show that under certain conditions, which are, I think, reasonable conditions, a great majority of people will prefer the outcome that comes from voting to a bunch of other alternative outcomes. So there's actually a lot to be said for treating this as essentially a political process rather than an economic process. The particular condition on which this is true is that inequality it's an inequality concerning the distribution of discount rates amongst the population. The left-hand side is the harmonic mean, the right-hand side is just a straight mean, arithmetic mean, and the median has to be between them. That's true for most of the distributions we've seen, actually, of discount rates. So maybe skip this and go to one more point. This is the point where I'm going to connect with what Greta Thunberg, according to today's Guardian, was talking about yesterday, which is the issue of corporate approaches to climate change. As I'm sure all very well aware, many corporations in the last month or so have made pledges to be, quote, net zero, unquote, by 2050. And in many cases, they're planning to use offsets to get to zero. And there's two questions I want to tackle. Maybe I just have time for the first one, actually, which is the use of offsets. But the two questions this raises are, is the use of offsets legitimate here? And secondly, how do we measure emissions? How do we measure corporate emissions? There are three measures of corporate emissions, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. You're probably mostly familiar with those. I'll define them in a minute if you're not. So what's an offset? An offset occurs when you persuade another entity to reduce its emissions, and you pay them for the right to call that reduction yours. So if I persuade you to reduce your emissions, and I pay you for that, I can claim the emission reduction as mine. And that's what's called an offset. And if you look at the sort of statements that most corporations have made on their intentions to go net zero by 2050, they all involve extensive use of offsets. Now, the basic point I want to make, 2 points I want to make, actually. One is that the world cannot get to zero via offsets. A fairly obvious piece of arithmetic. Suppose that E are the emissions of a country today, E sub I are the emissions of country I today, or country I, company I. R sub I is the reduction it brings about in its emissions by, say, 2050. And O is the offsets it purchases, so as to be net zero. Then obviously these have to satisfy the equation there, E minus R minus O equals zero. Emissions of entity I minus the reduction in emissions by entity I minus the offsets has to equal zero. That's what it means to be net zero using offsets. Now, if we add that up over all entities, let's say over all corporations, we've got that the sum of emissions minus the sum of reductions is equal to the sum of offsets, obviously. And the sum of offsets is not zero. Therefore, there's still a net positive emissions. That's intuitively very obvious. But if every company can claim to be net zero by buying offsets, but the world as a whole is nowhere near zero. And that's the fundamental flaw with offsets. Okay? Now, there's another point about offsets, however, slightly around the contradiction. This is a very quick example. Country A can reduce emissions for $70 a ton. Marginal cost of reduction is $70 a ton, but it's only willing to pay $60 a ton. So it won't on its own reduce. Country B can reduce emissions for $50 a ton. So its marginal abatement cost is just lower, $50 a ton. It might be a developing country. It's often cheaper to abate in developing countries. But it's only willing to pay $40 a ton. So neither country on its own will cut back emissions. However, country A can pay country B to reduce emissions profitably. So the introduction of an offset market, an international offset market, actually creates a reduction in emissions which would not otherwise have occurred. Okay, so the offset market has facilitated an emission reduction. Okay, so the bottom right line here is there is a role for offsets. Offsets can generate reductions in emissions which would not otherwise have occurred. But in the end game, all offsets have to be zero. If we're going to be net zero in 2050, there must not be any offsets left there. They all have to be phased out by then. Okay, just one more last one. So how does this connect with Greta Thunberg? Greta Thunberg was apparently going on about the evilness of offsets at the meeting yesterday, so I just mentioned the connection there. Okay, final category issue, categories of emissions. Scope 1 is direct emissions from operations. So for example, Columbia University burns natural gas in order to heat its buildings. The CO2 emissions coming from that are Scope 1 emissions. Scope 2 emissions, emissions from power purchased. So Columbia University buys electric power from generators. In the process of generating that power, they're producing CO2 emissions. That counts as our Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions, all other emissions associated with the supply chain and with the use of the product. Now, obviously, as soon as you think about this for 5 minutes, there's a massive amount of double counting there, right? I mean, if you just cannot add these things up and get a reasonable number. Because, Columbia University's Scope 2 emissions, which are the emissions associated with the electricity that we buy, are somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. Exxon, for example, sells gasoline, let's say, to American Airlines. When that gasoline is burnt, it produces CO2 emissions. That's Exxon's Scope 3 emissions, but it's also American Airlines' Scope 1 emissions. And if American Airlines is running an aircraft made by Boeing, it's Boeing's Scope 3 emissions. I've actually found some things in this data which are counted, not just double counted, they're counted 5 times when you add all these things up. So this process is actually not very informative. If you think about it carefully, if every company gets its Scope 1 emissions down to 0, there are no emissions left. So the instructions we should give to companies, and this is what picks up from what Richard was talking about at dinner last night, the instructions we should give to companies are reduce your Scope 1 emissions to 0, forget about the rest of them, and don't use offsets. You can use offsets to get there, but in the end game, the offsets must be 0. I've way overstayed my welcome, I'm afraid, so I'm sorry about that, but I hope it's been entertaining. Thank you.
We actually have time for about 1 or 2 questions.
Oh, that's surprising. Good. Thank you.
Curious about the debate, the 100-year debate. So is that an American debate, or is it involving economists from other countries?
It's a kind of transatlantic debate, actually, isn't it, Joe? I mean, I think on the whole, Joe knows more about this than I do, but on the whole, the British economists or European economists tend to be in favor of low discount rates, and the American economists tend to be more market-based and arguing in favor of a market discount rate. But there are exceptions, and I'm this side of the Atlantic, and I'm in favor of a low discount rate, and I'm sure Joe is too. I think probably Eric is as well. Yes.
Economists in East Asia that have been surveyed also? Any other, broader beyond the West?
That's an interesting question. I know a number of obviously Asian economists, but I'm not aware of what their position is on this issue. Anybody in the audience know that? Plenty of prominent economists here, but no. Yeah, we might. Yeah, I mean that survey that I cited earlier on by a guy called Moritz Drupp. That survey is supposedly actually most economists who've written on the issue of climate change. That wouldn't actually include both some Japanese and some Korean economists. They're mainly people who are operating in this country.
Jeff, you're absolutely right about the dispute over the discount rate, but I wonder whether to some extent it might not be a false debate. That is, there are really 2 things going on. The way individuals regard the future and discount the future, and the way that we as a society regard future generations. And there's no particular reason why those 2 discount rates have to be the same.
Yes, well, that's absolutely right. I mean, and that's really the big difference between the market approach and the benign planner approach. I mean, the market essentially takes individual attitudes towards the future. your attitude and my attitude and so on, synthesizes those. Whereas the benign planner in principle is taking a kind of a more intergenerational perspective, based less on individuals' assessment of what the future is worth to them. Yeah, that's right. That's a good way of putting it, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, let me say, one can put it in a slightly different way, which is that if you believe that there was an actual planner, or the government redistributed income optimally across generations, then there might be an argument that there, apart from the externalities you identified, that there be some relationship between social discount factors and the market interest rate. But if you don't, if you have an overlapping generations model, if you have people with finite lives, or there's not, then you wind up in the kind of world that Phelps and Pollock are in, and there is no reason that you would expect that there be any relationship between the market rate of interest and our ethical valuations. And just to, I was in charge of the committee that sets the interest rates in the Clinton administration, and we had a lot of fight. The view that I expressed is that it should be a very low number and lower than the market rate of interest.
Absolutely.
And that view, particularly for long-term climate change purposes. And one way of thinking about it is that the market rate of interest that in terms of what is the consumer rate of interest, not the producer, which is the safe rate of interest, is already 0.5% or lower. It's been negative recently. The market rate of interest that we see in the return on capital embeds risk and market imperfections.
Right.
And that if you incorporate any reasonable perspective on the risk and the states of nature where climate change is worse than we think, reflecting the uncertainty, then you would think of climate mitigation as an insurance policy, and you would want to use an interest rate lower than the safe rate of interest. So I guess my view on this is that if you look at it from these perspectives, it's not just a question of opinion about what the delta is. It's a question of bad economic analysis, and that the integrated assessment models just have gotten, left out things that are almost obviously true, that we don't optimally redistribute, we don't optimally manage risk, and that there is this negative correlation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think you've made an important point there, actually, Joe, which I didn't have time to make, which is that people talk about the interest rate, but actually there's a multitude of interest rates depending on the time period that we're dealing with and the risk parameters that we're dealing with. And most governments actually use a single interest rate, which is independent of the maturity of the project and independent of the risk classification of the project, and that's clearly wrong. So if you're going to rely on the market, you need to differentiate by maturity and by risk category, which, for example, OMB doesn't. Yeah.
We're running out of time, but okay, we can do a couple more then, says Lizzie. David was here waiting.
Just a quick question. I was curious to know if you thought that there was particular relevance for tracking Scope 3 emissions in the banking sector, which is somewhat of a new thing that they're tracking as opposed to Scope 1.
There's a lot of attention is focused on the banking sector, and I think that the issue there is not so much the magnitude of their Scope 3 emissions, because those are always somebody else's Scope 1 emissions. The issue is, can they in fact be used as a vehicle for putting pressure on people to reduce emissions? Because, there's the follow the money argument. Constructing coal-fired power stations has to be financed. They're very capital intensive, and it's usually 4 or 5 years before they produce any income. Therefore, they need building finance, loan finance. And if you can persuade banks that's not a right thing to do, then they won't be able to build coal-fired power stations. So I think that's why activists are focusing on banks. because they play a strategic role in funding some of these carbon-intensive projects. And I think it's better to think of it in that category than it is to think of it as a Scope 3 emission issue. Bruce.
Jeff, how does population growth or population shrinkage fit into this?
That's an interesting question. It actually just usually doesn't feature in these models. They take an exogenous population growth. Obviously, in practice, the fact that by 2050 we expect the world's population to go up by what, 1.5 billion or something horrible like that, makes the problem much worse, and it means that the future. It means that typically we'd expect people in the future to be somewhat less well off than today, simply because of the pressure on resources, and other things being equal. But I don't think. It's a lot more. Yeah, right. So I mean, if you weight costs not only by their futurity but by the number of people experiencing them, it increases the salience a lot. Yeah, that's an interesting question. Most of these IAMs don't have a very specific treatment of population. It's just sort of exogenous. Very few of them build in any explicit modeling of how population is likely to grow over time.
Except in one respect, which is that there's a probability that the world has extinction for other reasons.
Yes.
And so that is used as the argument for a delta, that if there's nobody, we don't have to worry about climate change.
Yeah, that's the argument in the Stern Review. That's Nick Stern's argument. That's right. Yes, yes.
All right, so I think with that we will turn things over to Joe.
Okay, right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'm the last speaker, and I don't have a PowerPoint. I guess this is supposed to be more relaxing. I'm want to first begin by congratulating Ned and the center on this 21st anniversary of the center, which has become, in that 2 decades, the premier center for thinking about the role of capitalism in our society. I think the name of the center is very evocative, and it is disappointing that there aren't more centers around the world thinking about this issue. Approaching it from a multidisciplinary way, we've had presentations from very different, from philosophy, from cultural studies, and understanding capitalism in a very broad sense. And the breadth of that reflects not just the standard economic model, and I'll have a lot to say about that later. It's been engaged in debating the fundamental issues of how various economic forms affect not only economic performance narrowly defined, but societal well-being broadly understood. And I want to emphasize that it's about, in the way sometimes in the political rhetoric I say, society, the economy is not supposed to. Individuals are not supposed to serve the economy. The economy is supposed to serve society, and that we want to construct an economy that reflects what is best for our society in a very broad way. And in thinking about this, the center, some of the things that are up there has stressed the importance of equality, of innovation, the dangers of discrimination, and the dangers, it hasn't come up that much, but Ned talks about a lot of corporatism, the changes of various forms of organization that can suppress innovation. But Ned and the center has insisted rigorous analysis is required to understand these deep underlying forces. But at the same time, economists must engage with the central policy issues of the day. So it's not just been abstract, it's been trying to deal with the policy issues. Now, Ned has suggested that in the few minutes I have this afternoon, I touch on some topics that may not have been touched upon in the course of the conference. That was an impossible task because almost everything has been touched upon. But as always, they haven't touched on it exactly in the way that I would have touched upon it. And that gives me some opportunity to make some comments that will be in some ways repetitious or echoing what's been said before, but hopefully put into somewhat different context. And in the limited amount of time, and I haven't checked the time, that says 00, but I think that must not be right. I haven't yet overstood my time, so I'm going to try to talk about 6 topics. So I'm going to be running through it, but I'm going to begin with something that Roman has talked about and a number of other people have talked about, and Ned has worked on, which is I referred to as deep uncertainty. The pandemic and the crisis of 2008 illustrates the deep flaws of models based on rational expectations, which have played a central role in economics for the last several decades. In those macroeconomic models, the only source of uncertainty is technological shocks with known distributions where the structure of the economy is fully known. The last talk that we had just from Jeff illustrates the fact that we don't know a lot about things that are really important. We don't know what will happen if we have a little thing like 3 degrees climate change. And, but we do know that it could have very big effects. So as we try to model how we should respond to climate change, what would happen if we have 3.5 degrees or 3 degrees temperature change is just what we don't know about. We know what we don't know, as Rumsfeld once put it. But economists have been remarkable in not knowing that we don't know and have assumed that we know everything, and that actually has profound effects. And I think, you know, when I think about what is deeply wrong about Nordhaus's work and the IAMs, the integrated assessment models, I put that really high on the list of things that I think are wrong. The notion in macroeconomics, this is also a really big problem. The notion that well, first of all, we repeatedly face new shocks. There are events that are the most important and most momentous. The crisis of 2008 was not anticipated. The pandemic was not anticipated. The election of Trump was not anticipated. Something like that, a lot of people said could happen, but it was worse than anybody could have imagined. And the notion, and in a way, several of the papers this morning and the work that Peter has been engaged in, like Schubertian, the nature of the economy is that it's always giving rise to new shocks. We can't fully know changes in technology, because if we knew it, we would have already had it. So it's intrinsically the case that there is going to be things we don't know. And the remark that was made by our philosophers saying that some of the most important changes are changes in values, those are also unpredictable. And the ones that are most interesting are those that give the largest conflicts to what our previous values were that are the most dramatic. So the nature of any economic system, and particularly capitalism, is that there are always going to be these shocks. It's intrinsic to the model. And so again, to criticize some of my colleagues, that work, which is based on DSGE, Dynamic Stochastic General Equilibrium models, and I'll come back to that, are intrinsically not able to deal with the problems that are most important in our society and a capitalist economy. And the notion that is very deep in these models, that there would be common knowledge, which is a formal idea that everybody shares the same probability distributions. And there's an interesting mathematical work on that. But that notion that there be that common knowledge is really absurd. It's not only absurd, it leads to a different kind of economics. That is to say, economies with dispersions of beliefs behave fundamentally different from economies in which everybody has common knowledge. That dispersion of beliefs gives rise to trades, Beck's. Martin Guzman and I have done a lot of work on the notion of pseudo-wealth, that it gives rise to a belief that we're wealthier in the aggregate than we are actually. And that in turn, that fluctuations in pseudo-wealth give rise to macroeconomic fluctuations that are not a result of technology shocks in the way the standard DSGE models believe. Put in another way, the economy cannot be described by a stationary stochastic process. And when we start thinking about how do we as individuals behave in that kind of environment, this is the kind of work that Eric has done a lot of work on, the kind of models, decision theory models that assume we have all that just don't work very well. Now, admittedly, we don't really have fully developed, this is I think, one of the areas, interesting areas for research is how people behave, ought to behave, how societies do behave or ought to behave in the context of this deep uncertainty, and I'm going to come to that in a second. But to me, I think this is really one of the most important areas. One of the implications of it is that the key issue in responding to many of these events is how do we respond to risk? What kinds of precautionary behaviors do we want to build into our lives? And that is fundamentally different from the intertemporal maximization problems that are at the center of the integrated assessment models and at the center of the DSGE models. They've focused on intertemporal allocation. And what I'm suggesting is that in these moments which keep confronting us of deep uncertainty, it's really how we respond to precautionary behavior, respond to that kind of risk, and understanding that is really first order importance. Just as one example of that, in the pandemic, one of the things that happened was the second quarter of 2020, the savings rate in the United States increased to around 25% for a country where normally the savings rate is 0 or 5%. You cannot explain that by intertemporal maximization. And for those at the top, the savings rate went over 40%. So that was the average savings rate. So you know something else is going on. They're not solving that integral maximization problem. There was something else going on driving behavior. Well, so this in turn means that we have to have a different framework for policy making. So, for instance, one of the important aspects that discussed in previous conferences here is that in monetary policy, they often talk about the importance of commitment, because the key issue they face is, if they're worried about, is inflation, and commitment is the way you reduce inflation. The problem is, with commitment, is the danger is you make a commitment to the wrong world, to the wrong model. So first beginnings of this discussion of commitment was when monetarism was the prevailing doctrine. The view of Milton Friedman that the velocity of circulation, this is so old that many of the younger people here never heard of these ideas. You're better off because you've never, but there's so many bad ideas you can learn. We've been teaching you one set of bad ideas, and I don't want to clutter your mind with another set of bad ideas, but for the elderly people here, monetarism was one of those. And it was all based on the belief that the velocity of circulation of money was fixed. And that became a dominant policy doctrine just when the evidence was that it was not true. And if you think of a world, if you believe that world and you made a commitment based on a model for which that was the central tenet, you were tethering yourself to a really bad model. So the question is, you want some commitment, but you don't want too much commitment because you know that you don't know. And that means that you have to be able to adapt to a different world. Well, that means that I wish John Paul were here in person. He gave a good criticism of the European macroeconomic framework with its commitments to 2% inflation, 3% deficit, 60% debt. That is a really dangerous framework for policymaking when the world changes and events happen that you could not have anticipated. Just to give a little advertising, I've been doing a little work. Peter Orszag, Bob Rubin, and I have written a paper about how to respond to this. And the paper is as interesting from the fact that the three of us were able to write a paper together as it is of what we said. But what we said was that in this kind of world with deep uncertainty, you cannot use these top-down anchors, and that there are still some things that you know with a higher degree of certainty. So that, for instance, you know that if there is a high level of unemployment, you will want to have unemployment insurance. You don't want people to starve, almost surely. Yeah, it may be that an event will happen where that's the best policy, but almost surely you don't. So the argument that we put forward is that you want to incorporate into your policy frameworks automatically the things that you know you will almost surely want, and that leaves policymakers time to focus more on discretion in the areas that are distinctive. So it focuses on the greater use of automatic stabilizers. Those are almost surely going to work. But then at the same time, leaving more scope for discretion. Well, I've seen that my time has gone faster than I had anticipated, and so I'm going to just go through very quickly some of the other topics. The second topic I wanted to talk about is related in this, is the use of equilibrium models versus evolutionary models. Economists like equilibrium models, but in the world that I just described, equilibrium is not really likely to be a good description of the economy or a good framework for policy. And so when I criticize dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, the part of it that I really criticize is the equilibrium assumption. And what's so bad about that is that it assumes that the economy is in equilibrium, then gets disturbed in 2008, 2020, 2016, Brexit, you keep listing. And the moment after that, everybody in the economy believes we're back on an equilibrium path, never to be disturbed again. It takes a kind of cognitive dissonance that you can have this kind of framework where you constantly are disturbed and you constantly then proceed as if you were never going to be disturbed again. I think evolutionary models give a lot better insight, but we haven't developed those as well. One of Ned's co-authors, Sidney Winters, did a lot of work in this area. The important point about evolutionary models, I think that for a point I want to raise is there's no teleology. There's no reason to believe that evolution is going in a way on its own that is going to make society better off. And we had some examples earlier of that, and I'll mention a couple later. So the point is, on the right, there's sort of a view sometimes that evolution, Hayek had sort of this view that just allowing the natural evolution was going to lead to society being better off. There's no presumption of that, and there's a lot of presumption that that's not the case. Now, that relates then to the next topic I want to talk about, which is the nature of innovation and importance of dynamism, which the center and Ned have stressed. But I want to go back for a second to the old economics, which is the first and second welfare theorem of economics, which is what we focus most of our teaching on. And that assumes that there is no change in technology, there's no endogenous innovation at all, and assumes that markets are competitive and individuals have perfect information. My own work was with Bruce was on that once you drop any one of these assumptions, you don't get the first theorem anymore. And as we once put it, the reason the invisible hand is invisible is that it's not there. And so there's no reason to believe that the market is efficient. But I want to highlight that, that the way, this echoes a little bit Jean-Paul's remarks, that we begin with the first and second welfare theorem, and that creates a presumption that the market's efficient. But if we look around about many aspects of capitalism in the 21st century, we start thinking about a darker side of capitalism and a darker side of innovation. The opioid crisis, the food companies that have created an epidemic of childhood diabetes, the financial sector, the fossil fuel industry. We can go through sector after sector, and we can see many instances in which innovation and the strive for making profits does not lead to societal well-being. And one of the things that I liked about Peter's discussion is evidence that the competitive model, which is at the core model of what economists talk about, is no longer a good description of much of the American economy. And, Bruce in his work has been emphasizing that we're moving to a service sector economy where it's going to be even less competitive. So that the basic tool, and I jokingly say, the business school, what we try to teach what we teach our students, Warren Buffett put it very graphically. He says, that around corporations, there's a moat, and if there's a wide enough moat, even your idiot nephew could run the company. And what we try to teach in the business school, and what Warren Buffett says he instructs his executives to do, is to make that moat bigger and bigger. And we try to teach them how to do that without going to prison. And so, but that is really the darker side of innovation and the darker side of capitalism. And there's been a lot of innovation in the exercise of market power, in extending market power. If you look at some of the really clever contracts that are designed by companies like Visa, Sabre, they're really works of art of being able to maintain that moat. So you might say, oh, there's natural forces for competition. Yes, but you design contracts that can be sustained as a national equilibrium until the government says they are anti-competitive, and they do maintain an enormous amount of monopoly power. And, you know, this a question I would have asked, Peter, is exactly, you know, there has been this natural tendency to of the market in striving to make more profits is not only, and I say, not only to make better products, and that is the kind of thing that Ned has emphasized, the positive side, but there's also the negative side, which is the ability to entrench your profits and make more profits, including by exploiting others. And that there are lots of ways. There's been a lot of innovations in exploitation. And just to mention one, in the area of artificial intelligence and the social media, gathering information, being able to have discriminatory pricing, not perfect discriminatory pricing, because perfect discriminatory pricing would be Pareto efficient, but in between being able to extract more of the consumer surplus, and that distorts the market economy. I mean, what we haven't really fully talked about as much as we should is that the precept of the first welfare theorem, which is that everybody have the same price, has been undermined by innovation in the 21st century so that everybody now has a different price. So the whole idea that there is a single price, that everybody faces the same marginal rates of substitution, is no longer true in at least parts of our economy. So let me just mention two more things, and then I'll stop. One aspect of this that is particularly disturbing is, you know, when I did my work, and Bruce and some other people, on the economics of information, we didn't focus as much on the problem of disinformation and misinformation. Bruce and I wrote one paper on fraud, but it was one paper, and we thought we'd have laws about fraud, and we understood why it was important to have those laws to stop disinformation. But we now live in a world in which that's part of the business model of one of the most important sectors of our economy. And I think that illustrates the principle that innovation can be not only disruptive, but negative, not benign in any way, and raises, I think, very deep regulatory problems of how do we deal with it. And you know, I think that's one of the most exciting areas going forward. The final set of remarks I want to make has to do with the broad national innovation system, which is another co-author of NEGS. Dick Nelson has done a lot of work on thinking about our whole innovation system. As we think about our whole innovation system, we talked about part of it has to do with capitalism, but it's also basic research by government, the rules the government provides about when you have patents, what is an abuse of a patent. We're seeing an abuse of patents right now. We have a big controversy about the intellectual property waiver at the WTO. You know, these are really big issues for the welfare. There is a considerable amount of evidence that the patent system is going to cost us trillions of dollars. Trillions, because of the inability to those to use access to intellectual property that might have been able to curb to give more access to vaccines. You know, only 4% of those in the developing world have access to vaccines, and IPR is one, not only one, but is a major impediment to the spread of those vaccines. But as we think about innovation and the national innovation systems, I think we also need to think about innovation in the public sector. And that the public sector is an important part, not only the public sector, I would say the not-for-profit sector as well, of which we are a part. Columbia University is not part of we're part of the capitalist system in a broadly understood way, but a lot of the innovation goes on in our universities, but also in government. And we have also innovation in our institutional arrangements. And I think we want to make sure that we keep a broader perspective on this innovation. I was really pleased that Peter mentioned the Agricultural Extension Service, which was the primary way in which we had innovation in the 19th century, an economy in which agriculture was the central sector. It was government innovation, including this organizational innovation, that played a big role in the increase in America's standard of living. And now I think we need to think more about how we can create more innovation in the public sector. One of those that I've written about in my last book, People, Power, and Profits, is the public option as a way in which we have another provider of healthcare, student loans, mortgages, retirement products, that provides more choice, more competition, particularly in areas where we are confronting limitations in competition, as we heard about earlier, and more variety. So I just present that as an idea of as we think about dynamism in our society, in our economy, the role of the public sector and innovation in the public sector, I think needs to be incorporated. So let me conclude with, again, congratulating Ned and the Center for providing a forum, a space for us to assess and reimagine capitalism in the 21st century. As we strive to construct a social, political, and economic system that is inclusive and sustainable, fair, and efficient, that allows all individuals to fulfill their aspirations and potential, we need more discussions and dialogue of the kind that the Center has fostered for 20 years. Thank you, Ned. Thank you.
So I guess we're done. Well, Ned, do you want to do some questions, or what do you want to do?
Oh, let's announce the Joe, would you like a question or two?
If they're good questions and friendly.
All right. Let's get some good questions.
Joe, this is a narrow question, but it try to bring some of your work right back home. The pseudo-wealth work, the analysis might be extended to take a look at the incredible returns reported by university endowments just in the last week or two, which clearly must include some portion of the mark-to-market valuations of venture capital and private equity firms of assets that are not liquid and that are exposed, while the universities believe that they've made an enormous amount of money, but a certain amount of it may turn out to be pseudo-wealth. I wonder if that your work might extend to that.
It could be, but I actually think historically, the universities, a few universities, have done very well and far above the market. And I've pondered the question about why that is. And I've been a trustee, so of a university, of a college that's done enormously well. So I try to find out from the investment officers what was their magic, and they've over a long period of time. So this is not just 1 or 2 years, a long period of time. And I think there are two aspects of it. One of them is that the universities, the well-managed university endowments, have a longer time horizon. And that gives them opportunities that short-term capitalism doesn't provide. And that, this is part of the critique of our current system. And there's too much short-termism, and having institutions that have a longer-term horizon enables them to get a higher return. The other hypothesis, and I think is inside information. Inside trading is part of America, and again, it's one of the things you don't want to go to jail, so you have to be very careful. This is just a message to our students who wind up in Wall Street. But the universities have close links to some of the most dynamic firms in the economy. And, our students, as I said, I think we play a very important role in America's dynamic success. And so, emblematic of that is being Stanford, where they are in Silicon Valley, and very close connections with the venture capital firms that have helped finance. But all the universities, have used their endowments to make better judgments about this. And so it's not the usual kind of inside information, but it's a closer connection to the scientific community, technological community, and I think it's paid off. And it's a broader statement, maybe, that if we paid more attention to science and innovation, we'd be better off.
Thank you. I'd be very interested in your comments on a couple of suggestions that John Rawls made. One was that he questioned the possibility of a just capitalist society, and he picked up the idea from James Mead of what he called a property-owning democracy. And I'm not sure how that could ever come about, but I wonder I think too much is sometimes made of his rejection of capitalism, but he was concerned about so many of the things that have transpired in the development of capitalism, especially the control of government by big money interests. And so that's one idea. And also near the end of his life, he called for government to take the role of employer as last resort. I wonder what you think of that idea as well.
Yeah, so let me begin with that, because that's the easier question. I actually think that, and I talk about this in my last book, about the government playing that role. That we have, to a large extent, relied on indirect mechanisms. We say we passed a law in 1946 saying we're committed to full employment, but we use indirect mechanisms of monetary and fiscal policy, and those have failed, particularly for minority groups and for certain. So my view is, and what I say there is that if those instruments fail, that the right answer is that we ought to do that. India has done that in its rural employment guarantee schemes to a limited extent, but been very effective in my judgment. So I think, and I think that's much better than UBI, Universal Basic Income, because as I look particularly at the problems of climate change, caring for elderly, there's so much work that needs to be done, and people who want to do work, there's dignity in work, and all of that leads to the conclusion that there's a failure in some aspect of the market mechanism to link people who want to work and work that needs to be done, and if the market doesn't do that, then the government needs to step in. On the broader issue, I have a lot of sympathy with Rawls' perspective, and that goes to the, we've been talking about the way the market performs, behaves, capitalism, but key is the rules of the game. And I explored that in a book where we talk about how the rules of the game matter for the performance of the American economy, another book on the European economy. And the rules are set by a political process. And I mean the rules in a very broad way, including the conduct of monetary policy, whether you have industrial policy or not, the patent system and how you implement it. All of these grungy details have first-order effects on the way the system performs as a whole. But those rules are set in a political process. And one way of I interpret Rawls and Mead, who I worked with when I was in Cambridge as a student, is that though if you don't have sufficient degree of democracy and ownership, you will wind up with rules that will not implement. And we're seeing this, as Jeff was pointing out, that we can't get even, a critical vote is by somebody who is being bribed by the coal industry and is a coal. I think he actually owns a coal mine. So those special interests are going to play a disproportionate role in one way or another. So it is something where I think that when we think about equality of wealth and ownership, and I don't know how degree, but some degree of equality or avoiding the extremes of inequality are important, not just because of the direct social welfare assessment, but because of the political dynamics that then feeds into the rules, which then feeds into the way our whole system behaves.
Well, maybe I should call an end to this now. I want to thank you personally, and I want to thank you on behalf of the center for coming today and yesterday for these wonderful discussions. I'm very grateful, and I hope that maybe we've made a little difference today, and we'll go home thinking a little bit differently about this point or that point, and let's hope that we can, a year or two from now, we can have another such meeting, and
without masks.
Without masks. But I'll learn how to use a mask eventually. and until then, bon voyage.